The 13th and early 14th centuries marked the final hours of Europe's medieval warm period. For nearly 300 years, Europe had basked in relatively mild, stable weather. Crops flourished, populations boomed, towns grew. Trade routes stretched like arteries across Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, into India, and finally the steppes of Central Asia and beyond. But by the early 1300s, something shifted in the skies. From the year 1315 to 1317, Europe was stricken by what came to be known as the Great Famine. Torrential rains lashed the continent, day after day, month after month. Crops drowned, livestock died of rot and hunger, fields turned to mud. Starvation swept over villages and cities alike. It is estimated that 10 to 15% of Europe's population died in these few short years. The cold seasons grew longer. The summers grew wetter. A global climatic cooling event, now known as the Little Ice Age, had begun to take hold. And with it, the human immune system grew frail. Famine weakened the body. Disease followed close behind. A teeming Europe. By 1320, the continent's population had recovered somewhat from the famine. But beneath the surface, society was fragile. Europe had become densely populated, especially in cities. Urban hygiene was appalling. Most towns lacked sewer systems. People lived cheek to jowl, crowded in wooden homes, tossing waste into the streets. Horses, pigs, and chickens shared space with humans. Lice, fleas, and rats were constant companions. From Florence to London, from Paris to Ghent, market squares bustled, but so too did disease. Leprosy was widespread. Tuberculosis lurked in the lungs of the poor. Smallpox, dysentery, and typhus came in waves. And yet, Europe thrived. The Roman Catholic Church dominated the spiritual and political landscape. Monarchs ruled by divine right. Peasants toiled under the weight of feudal obligations. Merchants grew wealthy along the veins of the Silk Road. But the stage was set. Far to the east, the cradle of death. Meanwhile, on the fringes of recorded history, a slow and quiet process was underway. Deep in the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia, in the lands we now call Kyrgyzstan and western China, lived marmots, large rodents, native to the steppes and high plateaus. Within their blood, undetectable, unremarked upon by the world, existed a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. This microscopic killer, carried by fleas that fed on marmots and rodents, had no name then. But it had time. Time to evolve, to adapt, and in time, to move. Nomadic tribes hunted marmots for fur. They skinned them, carried them, traded them along the sprawling caravan routes that ran through Samarkand, Tabriz, and Aleppo, connecting the Mongol Empire with Persia and Europe. Each trade, each touch, each flea, a step closer to catastrophe. The Mongol Conduit. The Mongol Empire, by the early 1300s, stretched across the largest contiguous landmass in history. From the Danube to the Yellow Sea, it linked east and west in an unprecedented network of commerce and communication. Under Genghis Khan, and later his grandson Kublai Khan, the Silk Road was safe, patrolled, protected, flourishing. Merchants from Genoa and Venice traveled freely into Asia. Islamic scholars, Nestorian monks, and Chinese emissaries passed one another along these roads. But peace brought risk. Trade carried not just silk and spices, but parasites and pathogens. And in the heart of this network, nestled in the east, the plague began to spread among the rodents of Central Asia, rats, marmots, and gerbils, leaping silently between hosts. The plague reservoirs in the grasslands of the Gobi Desert and highlands of the Pamirs were waiting. The human world was moving toward them. The Genoese and the Black Sea ports. Far away, along the shores of the Black Sea, Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice had established colonies in trading cities like Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Crimea. These cities, perched between Europe and Asia, were gateways to the east. In Kaffa, the Genoese rubbed shoulders with Mongol leaders, Turkish mercenaries, Armenian traders, and Greek Christian bishops. All manner of languages filled the air. Ships arrived and departed daily, laden with spices, furs, porcelain, and occasionally rodents. It is here, in these warm coastal towns along the Crimean Peninsula, that plague would make its leap into Europe. But that part of the story was still 2 decades away. Life in 14th century Europe. To understand how devastating the Black Death would become, one must understand the lives it destroyed. In rural England, peasants lived under the rule of lords, farming strips of land for subsistence. A single poor harvest could mean starvation. In the cities, London, Paris, Bruges, Milan, Marseille, guilds regulated trade, apprentices learned crafts, and nobles schemed in stone halls. Monasteries held power both spiritual and financial, with monks copying texts, tending gardens, and aiding the poor. Women labored at home or in fields, their lives governed by the church's doctrine of sin and virtue. Children were apprenticed young. Life expectancy hovered around 35 to 40 years, and most died of infection, childbirth, famine, or war. Doctors wore robes and prayed for divine intervention. Hospitals were run by religious orders. Surgery was rudimentary. Most illnesses were attributed to imbalances of the four humors or to spiritual punishment. Astrology played a role in diagnosis. Sanitation was minimal. Still, life thrived. Music filled cathedrals. Trade bustled in ports. Universities flourished in Oxford, Bologna, and Paris. Humanity was unaware that beneath the soil and within the bloodstream of rodents, something ancient was waking. The calm before. On the 14th of September 1320, a caravan left Karakorum in Mongolia headed west, carrying silk, silver, and dried marmot pelts. Alongside the goods were fleas, infected and multiplying. By 1340, outbreaks of plague had already begun appearing in Chinese provinces. In the records of the Yuan dynasty, chroniclers wrote of entire towns emptied by sickness. In Hubei, Yunnan, and Sichuan, death was spreading, but word of it did not reach Europe. Not yet. The winds were shifting. The earth was growing colder. Populations were swollen, and trade lines tight with motion. Fleas were finding new hosts. Rats were boarding ships, and the human world had no resistance. What was coming would kill 75 to 200 million people worldwide. But for now, the markets of Bruges still bustled. The fields of Tuscany still bloomed. And in a forgotten corner of Central Asia, death sharpened its scythe. The awakening in the East, 1331 to 1345. The earliest confirmed reports of an outbreak resembling plague come from 1331, in the Hubei province of central China. Chinese imperial records from the Yuan dynasty, meticulously kept by court historians, describe a mysterious illness that killed rapidly and without mercy. The symptoms were ghastly: sudden fever, swelling in the groin or underarms, blackened flesh, and death within days. Local officials recorded that entire villages were emptied like husks. It was not a slow starvation, nor a civil rebellion. It was something new. By 1332, it had reached Hebei and the region surrounding Beijing. In 1334, in the city of Hopi, over 90% of the population reportedly perished. Scholars now estimate that within a few short years, this unknown contagion may have killed as many as 25 million people across eastern and central China, though precise numbers remain speculative due to the loss of records. This was no isolated event. The route through the Khanates. At the time, much of Asia was under the loose but powerful structure of the Mongol Empire, now fragmented into 4 Khanates. The Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China under Togon Timur. Trade routes still pulsed across the land, secured, taxed, and patrolled by Mongol forces. These highways of prosperity became arteries of death. By 1338, the plague had reached the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. Here, a small Nestorian Christian community in the Chu Valley left behind tombstones inscribed with phrases like, "died in pestilence." These graves, unearthed in the 19th century, mark one of the earliest physical confirmations of the plague's westward spread. Some of the bodies buried near Issyk-Kul have since been tested and found to contain Yersinia pestis DNA, matching modern strains, irrefutable proof that the Black Death had begun its journey west. Caravans and contagion. The mechanism of movement was commerce. Merchant caravans carrying silk, porcelain, jade, spices, and fur, especially marmot and sable pelts, traveled westward through Kashgar, Samarkand, Merv, and Herat. Fur, a luxury trade good, was often infested with fleas. The tightly packed wagons, drawn by oxen and camels, included handlers, animals, guards, and traders, all potential victims. One infected flea, biting a rodent, then a human, that was all it took. By 1340, the plague had reached the Khwarezm region, between the Aral Sea and the Caspian, devastating trading cities like Urgench. Reports from the time, collected in later Persian chronicles, mention city walls crumbling under the weight of corpses. Ala al-Din Abdul-Malik Juvayni, writing from the Ilkhanate, described entire districts falling silent overnight. The silence spread in Persia and India. In India, especially the Deccan Plateau and Sindh, traders returning from the north brought with them a sickness the locals had no name for. Sultans recorded an unknown, smothering disease in court annals. While local texts are cryptic, oral traditions suggest devastating loss. Simultaneously, in Persia, the great cities of Tabriz, Hamadan, and Shiraz began to suffer unexplained mass deaths. In 1346, the traveler and scholar Ibn al-Wardi, writing from Aleppo, recorded that India was depopulated, the Caspian cities desolate, and China turned to dust. This was a chain of outbreaks, a rolling thunder across a continent. The Siege of Kaffa, 1346 to 1347. Then came a flashpoint that would bridge east and west directly. In the year 1346, the Mongol general Yani Beg, ruler of the Golden Horde, laid siege to the Genoese-controlled port city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, one of the few remaining Latin Christian outposts in the Black Sea. Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, was a crucial trade hub for the Italians, and a thriving center of commerce. Its harbor was full of ships from Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople. The city was encircled by Mongol forces, who set up their camps just beyond the range of the city's defenses. Then something terrifying happened. A plague broke out among the Mongol troops. The disease tore through their ranks, killing thousands. According to Gabriel de Mussy, a Genoese chronicler, the Mongols, in a horrifying act of early biological warfare, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. Though modern historians debate the veracity of this claim, what followed is not in question. The defenders of Kaffa began dying. The disease spread among the population rapidly. Ships fled the harbor, carrying refugees and rats. They sailed west. The ports of entry. In spring of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys made port in Messina, on the island of Sicily. The reception was anything but welcoming. Local accounts from Messina describe crews hollow-eyed, with strange swellings, dropping dead in the streets. The townspeople begged the ships to leave. Some did, but it was too late. From Messina, the disease leapt to Trapani, Palermo, and then across the Strait of Messina to Reggio Calabria. By late summer, it had reached Marseille and Genoa. By autumn, Toulon, Pisa, and Livorno reported mass deaths. Each city followed a similar pattern. It began with a few unexplained deaths. Then the bodies began piling up in the streets. The clergy fled or died. The grave diggers could no longer keep up. The survivors burned incense, rang bells, or wept in silence. The plague had arrived in Europe. Symptoms and spread. The disease presented in several terrifying forms. Bubonic, with large, swollen lymph nodes, buboes, in the groin, armpits, or neck. Pneumonic, attacking the lungs, spread by coughing, with near 100% fatality when untreated. Septicemic, infecting the blood, turning the skin black, killing in hours. In each case, death was rapid. Sometimes within 24 to 48 hours of the first fever. Doctors were helpless. Priests were overwhelmed. Parents abandoned children. Husbands fled wives. And entire households vanished. By November 1347, Paris was on edge. In January 1348, the first deaths were recorded in Montpellier, then Avignon, seat of the papacy, where Pope Clement VI would soon take desperate measures to protect himself. But those stories belong to the coming chapters. Back in Central Asia, by the time the first European cities began burning their dead, the plague had already left a long red trail from China to the Volga, claiming tens of millions of lives. Some cities never recovered. Others vanished from maps entirely. The Black Death had become the first global pandemic, spread not by the will of men, but by the flea, the rat, and the market. Avignon, winter of 1347. In the papal city of Avignon, where Pope Clement VI reigned not from Rome but from the south of France, rumors began to swirl in the final weeks of 1347. Merchants and friars whispered of ships from the Black Sea arriving in Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, carrying more than just silks and spice. They brought with them a darkness that moved faster than reason, devouring the living, leaving only silence. By January 1348, the plague entered Avignon, despite frantic efforts to halt its progress. The city was densely populated, teeming with clergy, pilgrims, and bureaucrats. As the death toll rose, Clement VI took refuge within the vast stone walls of the Palace of the Popes, sealing himself away with a few attendants. Legend says he sat between two great fires, kept blazing day and night, in the belief that flame would cleanse the air. Outside, funeral processions gave way to bonfires. The cemeteries overflowed. One papal clerk wrote, "We dig graves no longer. We throw the dead into the river." Florence, spring of 1348. In the spring, the pestilence reached Florence. Giovanni Boccaccio, the famed humanist and writer, was an eyewitness. In his introduction to the Decameron, he would later write, "In the year of our Lord 1348, there appeared in the city of Florence a deadly pestilence, which began with swellings in the groin or under the armpits, and from these the disease moved inwards, and then soon after, the body was blackened or livid in color, and in 3 days the afflicted were dead." The city of art and commerce, once vibrant with trade and song, fell quiet. Workshops shuttered. Streets emptied. Priests abandoned churches. Bodies were left in doorways, sometimes stacked like firewood. Grave diggers, the Bacchini, worked through the night, often masked and wrapped in linen soaked with vinegar or rose water. Entire family lines disappeared in days. Noble and peasant, banker and beggar, none were spared. Florence's elite, those who could afford it, fled to villas in the countryside. Others barricaded themselves in palazzi, refusing to touch their own children or kiss their wives. By the time the wave passed, it is estimated that over 60% of the population had perished. The Arno flowed sluggishly, heavy with refuse and death. Paris, May to June, 1348. The plague reached Paris in early May. The French capital, boasting some 200,000 souls, was one of the largest cities in Europe and one of the most vulnerable. Crowded alleys, open gutters, and thousands of animals created a perfect environment for disease. At the University of Paris, scholars were divided. Some blamed the stars. Others claimed it was God's wrath. A treatise issued that June declared the conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in 1345 had corrupted the air with a foul celestial poison. Despite these celestial theories, the bodies continued to mount. The great cemetery of Les Innocents was quickly overwhelmed. Corpses were laid in mass pits, quicklime thrown over them. Bells tolled without pause. Priests, many of them infected, walked the streets offering last rites to the dying, then themselves fell dead by morning. The royal court, fearing contagion, left the city. King Philip VI retreated to safer country estates. The Parisian streets ran silent, save for the creaking wheels of death carts and the cries of orphans. London, autumn of 1348. In September of 1348, the plague crossed the English Channel, likely via merchant ships docking at Melcombe Regis, modern Weymouth, on the southern coast. Within weeks, the towns of Dorset, Hampshire, and Somerset were reporting sudden, massive die-offs. By November, it had reached London. The city was densely packed with timber-framed houses, narrow lanes, and open sewers. The Thames, choked with refuse, stank even in winter. It was here, in this press of humanity, that the pestilence found fertile ground. Contemporary chronicles describe London in near-apocalyptic terms. Children fell dead as they played. Dogs fed on corpses in the streets. Pregnant women miscarried from fright. And the dead outnumbered the living. King Edward III, ruling from Westminster, issued orders for citywide processions to beg God for mercy. He watched helplessly as members of his court died, including his daughter, Joan, who succumbed in Bordeaux while en route to her betrothal in Spain. The city's graveyards filled rapidly. A new plague pit was dug at Charterhouse, where thousands would be buried. Workmen labored without pause, throwing bodies into mass trenches, layer by layer, covered in quicklime. Monasteries were hit especially hard. In the London Charterhouse, nearly half the monks died. With so many priests dead, masses for the deceased could no longer be held. Reactions and rituals. Everywhere the plague went, it left behind not only death, but a shattered social fabric. In Germany, rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells. Pogroms erupted in Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz, where entire Jewish communities were massacred. In Catalonia, some towns turned to self-flagellation. Groups known as the Flagellants marched barefoot through the streets, whipping themselves in public squares to atone for humanity's sins, blood mixing with sweat as crowds watched in grim silence. In England, some believed dogs and cats carried the disease. Royal orders led to the mass killing of stray animals in London, an action that, ironically, may have worsened the plague by removing the predators of infected rats. In rural France, entire villages disappeared. In Auvergne, Limousin, and Normandy, farmsteads lay abandoned. Fields went unplowed. Bread prices soared, then collapsed. In Flanders, laborers deserted their posts. Weavers, millers, bakers, and brewers were gone. The fabric of commerce unraveled as swiftly as human lives. Across the Alps and the Rhine. As winter approached, the plague did not rest. By December 1348, it reached Switzerland, crossing over the Alps into the Italian-speaking cantons. Soon, cities like Zurich, Lucerne, and Basel burned with infection. The cold did not stop it. Fleas buried deep in fur and bedding kept the bacterium alive. In the Holy Roman Empire, cities like Cologne, Nuremberg, and Erfurt witnessed the same horrific scenes. Corpses stacked outside churches. Streets hushed. Processions of plague carts moving silently at dusk. In Vienna, the Duke's court scattered to the countryside. Yet even remote estates could not always protect their inhabitants. The plague traveled with people, in carts, in grain, in cloth. Mortality across the map. By early 1349, estimates suggested that in cities like Florence, London, and Paris, half the population had died. In the countryside, whole manors were left without lords or servants. Churches stood empty. Markets collapsed. Universities closed their gates. The gears of medieval society ground to a halt. The dead were countless. Burial customs vanished. Wills went unwitnessed. Children became orphans by the hour. And yet, the plague had not yet finished its journey. It had yet to reach Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, or the depths of the Iberian Peninsula. But it would. It moved not in a straight line, but like a tide, withdrawing, then returning, changing shape, hiding in the bones of rats and the folds of cloth. It moved at the speed of ships and horses. It moved faster than understanding. And by spring of 1349, no one in Europe could remember the world before. The Baltic winds, Scandinavia's first toll. As the spring thaw of 1349 softened the harbors of the North Sea, the plague moved steadily into the northernmost frontiers of Europe. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, though isolated by seas and mountains, were not spared. In early May 1349, a trading vessel arrived at the bustling Norwegian port of Bergen, likely from England or the Low Countries. It drifted into the harbor under a gray sky, carrying sacks of grain and silks, and corpses. Every man aboard was either dead or dying. The crew had fallen before making landfall. Local dockworkers boarded the ghost ship to investigate and, unknowingly, carried plague-ridden fleas ashore in their clothing and hair. The contagion spread quickly through Bergen's narrow wooden lanes. Within weeks, it had traveled up the fjords, reaching inland towns and isolated farms. By summer, Trondheim, and then Oslo, began reporting similar scenes. Coughing, blackened skin, swollen buboes, and sudden death. Norwegian royal records later estimated that 2/3 of the population died within the span of 1 year. The bishopric in Hamar fell silent. Entire churches went unattended. In small fishing villages along the coast, no one was left to light the fires, haul the nets, or ring the bells for the dead. Sweden and Denmark. In Sweden, the plague arrived by land from Norway and by sea from Denmark. The royal court in Uppsala tried to limit the damage by closing roads and ordering prayer processions. But death moved faster than decrees. The Swedish chronicle Ericus Olaus Chronica Regni Swici later recalled. In the year of grace 1350, such a great mortality raged throughout the kingdom that men fell as wheat before the scythe, and even the forest seemed to go quiet. Monasteries emptied. Peasant farms lay fallow. The king, Magnus IV, issued new tax remissions for survivors, recognizing that much of the rural economy had ceased to function. Land passed unclaimed. Serfs vanished. In Denmark, the cities of Aalborg, Roskilde, and Copenhagen fell in quick succession. Death struck so many clergy that, in several dioceses, no priests remained to ordain replacements. Church bells tolled until ropes frayed and hands blistered. By the end of 1350, much of Scandinavia was plunged into a silence broken only by the sound of carts and weeping. The plague in the east, Poland and Bohemia. The eastern march of the plague met a curious resistance at the border of Poland. Chronicles from the Kingdom of Poland, ruled at the time by King Casimir III the Great, indicate a lower death toll than surrounding regions. Historians have debated this anomaly for centuries. Some attribute it to geographic luck. Poland's relative isolation from major trade routes at the time may have spared it the worst. Others suggest strict quarantine practices were quickly enacted at border towns, or that the Jewish communities, often blamed elsewhere, practiced hygiene and dietary laws that incidentally slowed the spread. Even so, some cities did suffer. In Krakow, burials overwhelmed the cemeteries. Trade with infected neighbors brought periodic outbreaks. In Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, Prague suffered heavily. Charles IV, King of Bohemia and future Holy Roman Emperor, ordered religious processions and the burning of incense. Despite the efforts, death infiltrated the city walls. Monasteries, some built atop ancient hilltops, became isolated enclaves of silence. Their bells no longer rung. Orders like the Cistercians and Premonstratensians suffered immense losses. In some regions, up to 80% of monastic populations vanished. Hungary and the Balkans. The plague moved into Hungary in late 1349, likely along the Danube River, carried by merchant vessels. The flat plains and river ports made the area particularly vulnerable. In Buda and Pest, the twin cities that would later become modern-day Budapest, the disease tore through merchant quarters, churches, and bathhouses. Hungarian records, sparse but telling, speak of mass graves and abandoned fields. From there, it continued south into the Balkans. In Serbia, Bulgaria, and Albania, local populations had already been weakened by years of warfare and political fragmentation. The Ottomans were pressing northward. Amid this instability, the plague encountered little resistance. In Skopje, Thessaloniki, and Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, ports and caravan stops became epicenters of infection. Ships arriving from Constantinople or Venice brought more than goods. They carried rats and death. The Orthodox Church responded with liturgies and processions. Monks, often immune to neither disease nor fear, recorded the passing with sorrowful precision. One monk in Ohrid wrote, "Even the icons weep now. The oil runs dry. The candles burn alone." Spain and Portugal, the Iberian experience. While the plague had ravaged France and Italy, Iberia was spared until late 1348. The disease entered through Catalonia, with Barcelona and Valencia the first to fall. Both were major port cities, with bustling trade ties to France and the Mediterranean. In Barcelona, the chronicler Bernat Desclot wrote, "Death came not as a thief, but as a lion, roaring, bold, unrelenting." In Aragon, entire town councils collapsed. King Peter IV issued orders for forced quarantines, but few had the strength or knowledge to enforce them. Reports from Zaragoza and Lleida suggest population losses of over 50%. In Castile, the cities of Toledo, Seville, and Burgos fell in succession. Funeral pyres burned in open plazas. The famed Mezquita Cathedral of Córdoba, once a symbol of Andalusian grandeur, stood hushed as bodies piled outside. In Portugal, the plague reached Lisbon by 1349. King Afonso IV reportedly forbade ships from entering the harbor, but commerce overruled caution. Disease entered through smuggled cargo and desperate travelers. Fishermen, masons, cartwrights, entire guilds were wiped out. As coastal towns fell, the plague crept inland, following the river routes, reaching Coimbra, Evora, and Braga. The devastation was widespread, but uneven. Some mountain villages remained untouched, while others were completely extinguished, their names fading from records entirely. The Eastern Byzantine lands. In the weakening Byzantine Empire, the plague's arrival further shattered a realm already beset by political collapse and civil war. Constantinople, still grand but fraying, suffered immense loss. The Golden Horn echoed with the sound of oars bearing the dead to burial islands. Monks and courtiers alike succumbed. Emperors wept in private. The empire's outer provinces, Thrace, Anatolia, and Macedonia, saw death ripple through their populations, often without a single word entering official records. In Trebizond, Sinope, and other Black Sea ports, trade continued even as cities emptied. Caravans from the Silk Road still arrived, but fewer with each season. Silence began to fill the spaces once filled by shouting merchants. Russia's delayed scourge. Unlike Western Europe, Russia and the principalities of Kievan Rus and Muscovy experienced the plague later and more sporadically. It would not become widespread in these regions until the early 1350s, and even then, the record is murky. The vastness of the Russian landscape and the limited trade between its principal cities may have slowed the spread. Still, Novgorod, Pskov, and Moscow recorded losses by 1352. A chronicler in Tver noted that, "All the candles of the church are black. The bells ring not for weddings, but for wakes alone." The shattered soul of Christendom. As the Black Death swept across Europe with unrelenting speed, faith became both a shield and a wound. For many, religion was the first refuge. Prayers echoed in churches, rosaries clutched by dying hands, incense clouds rising in pestilential air. But as the plague refused to relent, even the most devout believers began to waver. In cathedrals, monks chanted litanies over empty pews. In villages, churches were locked, the priests inside already dead or fled. Some cried that the apocalypse had arrived, that the horsemen now roamed the earth. Others whispered that God had abandoned mankind. The Church under siege. The Roman Catholic Church, the great spiritual authority of medieval Europe, faced a spiritual catastrophe unlike any before. Bishops, priests, and nuns died in staggering numbers. In some areas, more than half of all clergy perished. In England, the Diocese of York lost 49% of its ordained clerics in just 18 months. In Avignon, the papal court was surrounded by death. More than 100 papal officials died between 1348 and 1350. Monasteries in France, Italy, and Spain fell silent, their bells cold, their gardens overgrown. The very custodians of God's grace were dying in droves. With no clergy to administer last rites, the dying passed without sacrament. Without priests to hear confession, sins went unshriven. Despair crept into theology. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI issued a general plenary indulgence. Anyone who died of the plague would receive absolution of all sins, no confession needed. It was an extraordinary act, signaling both compassion and desperation. The rise of the flagellants. In the spiritual vacuum, extremes took root. One of the most dramatic phenomena to emerge was the rise of the flagellant movement. Beginning in Germany around 1348, and spreading rapidly into Austria, Flanders, and Bohemia, groups of penitents began roaming from town to town, marching in processions, chanting hymns, and whipping themselves in public squares. Barefoot, hooded, often dressed in white linen stained with blood, they carried wooden crosses and sang the Dies Irae, the Latin hymn of the Day of Wrath. Twice daily, they would gather in the marketplace, kneel in a circle, and take turns flogging their own backs until the blood ran down to their feet. Children watched. Townspeople wept. The flagellants preached that the plague was divine punishment for sin, especially pride, greed, and the corruption of the church. Some targeted local bishops and abbots, denouncing them as godless and decadent. The church, initially hesitant, soon condemned them. In 1349, Pope Clement VI declared the movement heretical. But it was too late. In some cities, the flagellants replaced priests altogether, leading their own forms of worship. Millenarian beliefs and apocalyptic visions. With traditional explanations failing, many turned to apocalyptic interpretations. In the year 1350, rumors circulated in Italy and southern Germany that Christ had returned to earth, disguised as a beggar, and was walking among the people, testing their compassion. It was said that those who fed the stranger would be spared. Others claimed to see the Virgin Mary in the sky, weeping for humanity. In England, astrologers interpreted the conjunction of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter in Aquarius as a sign of divine wrath, connected to war and pestilence. The year 1345, when this planetary alignment occurred, was believed by many to be the true beginning of the end. Chroniclers described blood-red moons, stars falling, eclipses, and strange fogs rolling over cities as omens. In Florence, people spoke of voices in the wind. In Paris, witnesses claimed the Seine turned black. The veil between reality and myth grew thin. Pilgrimages and sacred sites. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, many took to the roads in search of salvation. Pilgrimages to sacred shrines and relics increased, even as travel carried risk of infection. Popular destinations included Canterbury in England, home to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket; Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, where St. James the Great was believed to rest; Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, considered a place of divine protection; the Holy House of Loreto in Italy, said to be carried by angels from Nazareth; the Cloak of St. Martin in Tours, which was paraded through towns to ward off death. Relics, bone fragments, nails, thorns, drops of blood, were bought, stolen, and fought over. Sellers of indulgences made fortunes promising buyers a place in heaven for a price. The boundary between faith and commerce blurred. In Cologne, a hair from the Virgin Mary's head was displayed in the cathedral. Thousands flocked to see it. In Trier, the tunic of Christ was carried through plague-stricken streets, as hundreds knelt in prayer, coughing into their sleeves. The scapegoating of the Jews. As terror mounted, blame turned outward. One of the darkest consequences of the spiritual collapse was the violent persecution of Jewish communities across Europe. Wild accusations spread that Jews had poisoned wells, causing the plague. The claims were baseless, but fear made facts irrelevant. In Basel, on January 9, 1349, the entire Jewish population, nearly 600 men, women, and children, were rounded up and burned alive in a wooden house built on the Rhine. In Strasbourg, even before the plague reached the city, over 2,000 Jews were massacred in February 1349. In Mainz, Erfurt, Cologne, and dozens of other cities, pogroms wiped out communities that had lived there for centuries. Some Christian leaders protested. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls condemning the violence, reminding the faithful that Jews suffered from the plague like everyone else. But his words held little power in the face of rage. By the end of 1350, over 300 Jewish communities across Europe had been destroyed. Survivors fled eastward, into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, where rulers offered relative protection. King Casimir III of Poland welcomed them, granting charters that allowed religious freedom and self-governance, laying the foundation for what would become one of Europe's largest Jewish populations in the centuries to follow. Saints, martyrs, and visions. Amid despair, stories of plague saints began to emerge. In Germany, Saint Roch was venerated for having survived the plague and healing others, despite being stricken himself. He was often depicted with a wound on his thigh and a faithful dog bringing him bread. In Italy, Saint Sebastian, long dead, pierced with arrows, became associated with pestilence, his body seen as a symbol of divine suffering. In France, people prayed to Saint Rosalia, whose relics were later credited with stopping outbreaks in Palermo. Mystics, often women, began reporting visions. Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress, later wrote of receiving divine showings during a period of grave illness around 1373. Though not directly tied to the plague, her writings reflect a deep spiritual response to suffering. In the monasteries that survived, some monks compiled books of the dead, writing the names of those lost and praying over them for years. These became both liturgical and psychological anchors, attempts to preserve memory in an age of forgetting. The transformation of ritual. Even religious rituals changed. Funerals were shortened or abandoned. The dead were buried in mass without priest or prayer. Masses were sometimes held without congregants, a lone priest chanting before empty pews. An economy without hands. By the midpoint of the Black Death's devastation, more than one-third, and in many regions over half of Europe's population had died. With them perished a labor force, a consumer base, and the deeply entrenched structure of feudal economies that had defined Europe since the fall of Rome. The medieval economy had not been built to withstand absence. It ran on people. Fields needed plowing. Mills needed hands. Markets needed voices. The plague emptied them all. Fallow fields and broken plows. In rural England, the most visible symptom of collapse was silence. Entire manors, once bustling with serfs, cattle, and harvesters, stood abandoned. Plow teams rotted in their yokes, left where they had fallen. Farm tools rusted in fields where the laborers had died or fled. The manorial system, which relied on peasant tenants to work the lord's land in exchange for protection and housing, began to crack. With tenants dead and no one to till the soil, land lay uncultivated. An English steward writing in 1350 lamented, "We cannot find men to till the earth. Even for high wages they will not stay. The wheat withers. The sheep wander without shepherd." In France, the fertile plains of the Isle de France and Aquitaine saw similar devastation. Vineyards turned to bramble. Olive orchards were untended. Farmers who had survived now demanded better terms, or simply took what land they wished. The collapse of labor control. Wages, once tightly controlled by law and custom, suddenly surged. In Florence, Milan, Bruges, and Cologne, textile workers, usually at the mercy of guilds and lords, found themselves in unprecedented demand. Looms sat idle. Wool remained unspun. Skilled artisans could now set their own terms. In England, the government panicked. The Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the subsequent Statute of Labourers, 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, making it illegal for peasants to demand higher pay or move to a different lord without permission. These laws were widely ignored. Workers simply refused. In Norfolk, entire villages left their lords and moved elsewhere, offering their labor to whomever paid the most. Lords, weakened by death and debt, could do little. By 1352, a carpenter could earn nearly double his wage from a decade earlier. Field hands and shepherds, once the lowest rung, commanded bargaining power. Laborers began to challenge the very social order. Guilds in turmoil. In the cities, guilds, the powerful associations of weavers, blacksmiths, bakers, and masons, faced a different crisis. Their membership rolls were decimated. Leadership changed hands rapidly due to deaths. Entire specialty crafts disappeared overnight. In Ghent, the Dyers Guild lost 72% of its members in 1 year. In Paris, the Butchers Guild collapsed and reformed 3 times between 1349 and 1352. Some guilds responded by loosening restrictions, allowing women, foreigners, and non-family apprentices to join, something unheard of before the plague. Others raised their entry fees, hoarding power in the hands of a few survivors. In Venice, new guilds emerged to replace dead ones, offering training for trades previously closed off to the poor. The artisan class began to expand and shift, sowing seeds for the emergence of a new urban middle class. The nobility's bleeding purse. The aristocracy suffered perhaps the most disorienting loss of power. Their wealth had always been rooted in land ownership, but land was now worthless without laborers to work it. In many cases, entire noble lines vanished. Estates fell into disrepair. Castles were left unstaffed. Noble widows found themselves surrounded by untended lands and no income. To raise cash, nobles leased lands, sold rights to hunt and fish, or taxed their remaining peasants more heavily. These short-term measures only deepened resentment. In Germany, counts and barons began marrying merchant daughters, seeking the coin of the rising burgher class. A new intermarriage between wealth and lineage began reshaping the European elite. In Castile and Burgundy, some lords began converting their estates from agriculture to pasture land, raising sheep and exporting wool. It was easier to manage, more profitable, and it required far fewer peasants. The agrarian economy began tilting toward capitalism, and the power of the nobility never fully recovered. Inflation and price shocks. The economic disruption caused wild fluctuations in prices. At first, with fewer mouths to feed, grain prices plummeted. Bread became briefly abundant. But as laborers died and production collapsed, food shortages returned, this time in areas that once had surpluses. In Milan, The price of grain quadrupled between March and July of 1349. In Rouen, wine prices crashed, while the cost of candles, suddenly in high demand for vigils and funerals, rose tenfold. Luxury goods became erratic in value. With fewer elite clients, goldsmiths and tailors faced ruin. But survivors with inherited wealth began buying art, jewelry, and books, driving up the price of skilled craftsmanship. The coinage supply, reliant on mining and minting, fell as miners died or deserted. Local lords in the Holy Roman Empire began issuing debased currency, fueling distrust and regional inflation. Inheritance and property transfer. The legal systems of inheritance were overwhelmed. With entire families gone, property defaulted to the church, the crown, or whoever claimed it first. Wills, hastily written or never made, created chaos. In Bruges, a merchant house changed hands 4 times in 1 year, due to deaths. In York, the city council appointed a clerk of the orphaned, charged with tracking unclaimed estates. In Bologna, property seized by the city was sold at auction to pay for plague pits and public maintenance. Women, often barred from property ownership, began appearing in records as heads of household, managing estates and vineyards. Widows and daughters held land in their own names for the first time in some regions. Some peasants seized abandoned lands, forming squatters' villages that evolved into permanent settlements. Land ownership, once rigidly hierarchical, was fracturing into something new: banking and credit. Banks and moneylenders were stunned by widespread defaults. Borrowers had died. Families refused to repay. Entire merchant partnerships were wiped out. The Peruzzi and Bardi banking families of Florence, already weakened by earlier wars, collapsed entirely. Credit dried up, forcing cities to issue municipal bonds to fund burials, repairs, and food supply. In Lucca, pawnbrokers took in crucifixes, chalices, and tapestries, anything to finance the living. Churches reluctantly sold off relics to raise money. Yet some lenders thrived. Jewish moneylenders, despite enduring pogroms, were often the only source of credit in rural areas. Their wealth increased even as their safety diminished. Urban changes and real estate reversal. Cities experienced a strange form of expansion through abandonment. In London, Bruges, and Florence, entire neighborhoods were left empty. With populations halved, survivors moved into better homes, often without permission or purchase. Hovels in alleys were forsaken. Grand homes stood open. Vertical living declined, as people chose houses with more space and fewer shared walls, early forms of urban sprawl. City councils, desperate for revenue, offered tax exemptions and citizenship to anyone who would resettle the abandoned districts. Builders and stonemasons were offered subsidies to repair crumbling infrastructure. The urban geography of Europe shifted rapidly in the 1350s. New wealth, new classes. Survivors often inherited wealth they never expected to see. Orphan children were now owners of vineyards. Former servants became landowners. Wives of dead tradesmen ran successful shops. A new, rough elite emerged from the ashes. In Florence, these self-made survivors were mocked by the old aristocracy as popolani grassi, the fat commoners. Yet they began funding churches, building palaces, and commissioning art. They reshaped politics in city republics, demanding seats on guild councils and seats in civic assemblies. A new kind of society was forming, less tied to lineage, more tied to liquidity. It was unstable. It was raw. But it was the future. A continent in mourning. By the early 1350s, as the last major wave of the plague receded across much of Europe, survivors emerged into a world transformed not just economically or politically, but psychologically. The death toll had been so vast, so swift, and so intimate that it reshaped how people thought, dreamed, and remembered. From the grand halls of kings to the dim kitchens of peasants, grief had become a daily state of being. Everyone had lost someone. Most had lost many. Some had lost all. In this new Europe, mourning was not a season, it was a life condition. Personal loss on an unimaginable scale. Families were often reduced to a single member. Entire family trees were erased within days. Wives were left without husbands, children without parents, monks without brothers, towns without mayors or scribes or blacksmiths. Chronicles are filled with stories like this. In Rouen, a baker returned from the countryside to find his entire street dead and his shop ransacked. In Perugia, a merchant's young daughter recorded in her prayer book the names of 38 family members, all dead by May 1348. In York, a widow named Matilda paid to have a mass said for 27 relatives in one ceremony, because she could not afford separate prayers. With so many buried in unmarked plague pits, traditional mourning practices collapsed. There were no wakes, no candlelit vigils, no quiet funerals beneath yew trees. Instead, mass trenches, unblessed ground, and silence. This disrupted the medieval belief in a proper death, a death with sacraments, prayers, and transition to purgatory. For many, this loss of spiritual passage was as terrifying as the physical death itself. Psychological trauma and collective numbness. We would call it mass trauma today, but medieval people understood it as a kind of spiritual derangement. Many survivors experienced profound changes in behavior. Numbness. Chroniclers describe people sitting for hours without speaking, staring into nothing, refusing to eat. Disassociation. Others wandered away from their homes, forgetting names, wandering barefoot through fields. Delirium. In some cities, outbreaks of plague madness were reported. People screaming at invisible figures, or claiming to see the dead walking. In Dijon, a city clerk named Etienne recorded in 1351, "I no longer feel the sun. I no longer feel my own heartbeat. I think I am buried but still moving." Some turned to obsessive memorializing, writing names in the margins of books, carving initials into walls, sewing scraps of clothing from lost children into their own garments. Others suppressed their grief entirely. A merchant in Lubeck simply wrote in his account book, "All my sons are dead. I have removed their names from the ledger." Dreams of the dead. The dead did not vanish quietly. In dreams, visions, and waking hallucinations, they returned, silent, accusing, pleading. In Catalonia, friars reported dreams of their dead brothers standing at the foot of their beds, silently pointing to the altar. In Naples, a noblewoman claimed to see her plague-stricken husband each night, standing at the hearth where he once warmed himself. In Utrecht, a peasant woman insisted that the children she had lost were still present, whispering in her ear. She set places for them at dinner each night. These visions were not always terrifying. Some were comforting, but they reflected a society in which death had become inseparable from life, an ever-present companion. Churches commissioned frescoes showing the souls of the dead climbing out of the earth, reaching toward angels, or fire. Sermons dwelt obsessively on the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. And yet, few had managed such a death. The rise of the macabre. Cultural expression took a dark and intimate turn. In sculpture, painting, and manuscript art, the dead appeared among the living, no longer idealized but skeletal, decayed, crawling with worms. The artistic style known as memento mori, remember you must die, emerged with fierce intensity. One of the most iconic expressions was the danse macabre, the dance of death. In murals across churches in Germany, France, and Switzerland, death was depicted as a skeleton leading people of all social classes in a dance. Popes, kings, merchants, and peasants all hand in hand with the dead. In Lubeck Cathedral, the mural painted in the cloister showed a procession of 24 figures, each paired with death. Beneath each figure was a verse, "I was rich, now I am dust. I was holy, now I rot." In Paris, itinerant performers acted out the danse macabre in churchyards, wearing skull masks and black robes, moving rhythmically as flutes and drums played. These performances were not simply morbid, they were reminders that death was universal, inescapable, and closer than ever. Shift in religious art and liturgy. Religious art before the plague had emphasized Christ as King, the Virgin as Queen of Heaven, and the saints as noble intercessors. After the plague, images changed. Christ crucified became more prominent, especially bleeding, suffering, and emaciated. The Virgin Mary was shown not as a celestial queen, but as Mater Dolorosa, the grieving mother, weeping beneath the cross. Saints were depicted battling death directly. Saint Michael with a sword, Saint Sebastian pierced by arrows but alive, Saint Roch showing his plague wound. Church music shifted too. Dirges and requiems became staples. The Dies Irae, a hymn of judgment and mourning, became central to the Mass for the dead. Choirs dwindled. The sound of a lone voice in an echoing nave became a common liturgical experience. Children and the transmission of fear. Children, often orphaned, carried scars that would last for generations. In Germany, children's rhymes took on dark tones. One rhyme, likely a Plague-era creation, would centuries later evolve into Ring Around the Rosie, with its reference to ashes, ashes, we all fall down. In Florence, orphanages were overflowing. One such institution, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, recorded over 800 new arrivals in a single year. Infants left at its door came with notes, sometimes with no names, just tokens, a button, a coin, a torn piece of ribbon. These children grew up amid death. Their drawings, preserved in rare cases, show skulls, coffins, crying mothers. Death became a character in childhood, not an abstraction. Literature and first-person reckoning. Writers who survived the plague attempted to reckon with what they had witnessed. Boccaccio, in the Decameron, opens with a raw description of plague-struck Florence, but the rest of the book is a series of stories told by survivors, often humorous or romantic, an escape from grief. Petrarch, the Italian poet and scholar, wrote in 1351, "I am left alone among the graves. The libraries are silent. The scribes are gone. What is learning now but a conversation with the dead?" In England, William Langland would begin his allegorical poem Piers Plowman, filled with images of injustice, death, and spiritual confusion, reflecting the moral disorder left in the plague's wake. Later, Geoffrey Chaucer, himself a child during the plague, would write the Canterbury Tales, framing his stories around a pilgrimage, a journey of souls seeking meaning in a shattered world. The contagion of silence. Perhaps most revealing of the trauma is how many survivors never wrote anything at all. The chronicles simply go dark. In dozens of abbeys, town halls, and city registers, the ink stops. A clerk's final words in Siena, written in 1348, read, "And then the pestilence came, and then no more. No follow-up, no entries, no afterword. Silence." In a world that valued lineage, memory, and record-keeping, this silence is thunderous. And yet, from this silence, a new voice would begin to rise. A voice that questioned old certainties, that imagined new ways of living, that dreamed of a world not ruled by death. But before that could happen, Europe had to remember how to live again. Panic, power, and the need to govern. As the plague tore across Europe, local and royal authorities scrambled not just to bury the dead, but to govern the living. The unprecedented mortality fractured social hierarchies, emptied councils, and appended centuries-old legal traditions. New decrees were drafted in haste, old laws repealed overnight, and entire regions left without functioning courts. The rule of law did not vanish, but it mutated. What emerged was a system of governance marked by urgency, improvisation, and control. Emergency decrees and quarantine orders. By the early 1350s, as successive waves of the plague rolled across Europe, cities began implementing formal health policies, many of which would lay the groundwork for future public health systems. In Venice, one of the first cities to institutionalize quarantine, a 40-day isolation period, 40 giorni, was imposed on ships arriving from infected ports. This was enforced not by priests but by a newly formed body of officials known as the Savii alla Sanita, Lords of Health. Ships were held at anchor, cargo inspected, and infected sailors forcibly removed and sent to lazarettos, isolation islands just offshore. By 1377, Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, implemented similar policies, and the practice spread rapidly across Mediterranean trade cities. Local magistrates were empowered to seal off neighborhoods, post guards at city gates, burn contaminated goods and bedding, enforce curfews with armed patrols. In Milan, plague-infected homes were bricked shut entirely, sometimes with the sick still inside, an early, brutal form of containment. These measures were ad hoc, often cruel, and inconsistently applied, but they marked a fundamental shift. Governments were beginning to intervene directly in the health and movement of their people. Legal chaos and the collapse of courts. In many cities, the legal system simply ceased to function for long stretches. Judges, lawyers, scribes, and bailiffs died or fled. In Paris, Bruges, and Naples, civil courts were suspended entirely for weeks at a time. Writs went unanswered. Trials were postponed indefinitely. In some towns, defendants simply walked free, their prosecutors dead or missing. Rural justice fared no better. With manorial lords dead and reeves gone, village disputes went unmediated, and local justice reverted to custom, vengeance, or silence. In England, the king's justices could not travel the countryside due to plague fears. Assize courts, which handled land disputes and serious crimes, were frozen. This vacuum allowed local gentry to accumulate judicial powers, some lawful, some not. In Florence, a notary recorded in 1350, "The prisons are full, but the judges are gone. The thieves do not wait." Rise of executive power. The crisis enabled central authorities, royal or civic, to expand their reach. In France, King Philip VI and his successors issued ordinances by royal decree, bypassing traditional legislative assemblies. These decrees regulated grain prices, movement between towns, burial practices, and even what kinds of cloth could be worn during mourning. In England, Edward III used emergency powers to enforce labor statutes, draft soldiers, and demand forced loans from wealthy merchants. Though Parliament met sporadically, royal prerogative grew stronger. In the Papal States, Pope Clement VI claimed the right to assign or reclaim lands left ownerless by the plague. This centralized papal power over both spiritual and temporal realms. In the cities of northern Italy, ruling families like the Visconti of Milan and the Medici of Florence used the chaos to cement their control, often under the banner of emergency governance. This period gave rise to proto-absolutist regimes, justified not by divine right alone, but by the necessity of restoring order. Laws of the dead and the disinherited. With inheritance patterns shattered, new laws were required to determine who owned what in the aftermath. Legal complications exploded. Families were extinguished before wills could be executed. Executors were dead or missing. Children were left without guardians. Widows without dowries. Tenants without landlords. Municipal councils in cities like Brussels, Zaragoza, and Florence passed emergency inheritance ordinances, streamlining succession. If no heir could be found, properties reverted to the crown or city. In Bologna, a 1351 law created state-appointed estate managers, tasked with overseeing properties until a legal claimant could be found. Fraud was rampant. Forgery of wills became a major crime in this period, leading to some of the earliest forensic handwriting analysis practices in civil court. The question of who owned the future was now a legal one. Land and serfdom in transition. The plague opened cracks in the rigid structure of feudal bondage. In England, the Statute of Labourers, 1351, tried to freeze wages and prohibit peasants from leaving their manors. It decreed that no one could pay higher wages than in 1346. No laborer could refuse work without cause. Those found idling would be forced back to service. Enforcement proved impossible. Laborers ignored the law, lords bribed them anyway, and many simply vanished, taking work in more favorable lands. In France, surviving peasants in Languedoc, Brittany, and Normandy began demanding written contracts rather than traditional feudal duties. This slow erosion of serfdom varied by region but had begun. Free tenancies replaced old oaths. Rent replaced service. The plague had forced a renegotiation of the human contract with the land. The law as protector and oppressor. Legal systems became tools both of protection and repression. Cities that had been largely self-governing now saw external control imposed. Milan, Padua, and Verona established boards of health with powers to inspect homes, arrest the sick, and burn belongings. These boards would later evolve into the first true municipal health departments. In Germany, civic leaders passed laws to punish price gouging, hoarding, and fear-mongering. Merchants were fined or exiled for spreading panic. In some places, merely mentioning pestilence in public could result in arrest. In Barcelona, laws were passed limiting public weeping and funeral gatherings, under the belief that excessive mourning was both spiritually harmful and a cause of contagion. In Florence, mourning clothing was regulated. Black was restricted to specific relatives, and laws limited the time one could wear it. Yet alongside repression, some protections did emerge. Laws guaranteeing burial for the poor, at public expense. Charters granting freedoms to orphans, allowing them to work or marry without permission. Debt forgiveness acts in some cities, where debts of plague-dead persons were cancelled. The plague had made the law fluid, dangerous, and at times, merciful. Birth of bureaucracy and record-keeping. Amid chaos, a strange order began to form. To cope with mass death and property transfer, cities began keeping more detailed records than ever before. Bureaucracy expanded. In Florence, new offices were created to manage orphan affairs, opera degli innocenti. In London, coroners were ordered to maintain lists of plague burials, including cause of death. In Seville, city officials required landlords to report vacant homes and unclaimed estates. In Prague, the city registry began recording survivors, not just the dead. These bureaucratic innovations would outlast the plague, becoming fixtures of modern governance. Fractured crowns and fading thrones. By the time the plague began to recede in waves around 1352, many of Europe's monarchies and principalities were in crisis, not from war or rebellion, but from absentee governance and demographic collapse. Power structures that had seemed eternal just a decade earlier were now weakened, hollowed out, or altogether extinguished. Entire dynasties vanished. Heirs died before they could inherit. Vassals seized autonomy. Rival claimants emerged. In the wake of mortality, the political map of Europe began to bleed at the edges. The waning of feudal monarchies. In France, King Philip VI had survived the plague, but not without consequence. Entire regions, especially Normandy, Aquitaine, and Languedoc, were so depopulated that tax revenues plunged. Many nobles, facing economic ruin, sold or ceded lands to larger, more centralized authorities, accelerating the consolidation of royal control. The Hundred Years' War, which had begun in 1337, paused briefly during the worst of the pestilence but resumed by the early 1350s. Yet now, France's feudal levies were broken. The lords were dead or bankrupt, the peasants unwilling to fight. This led to professionalization of warfare. France began hiring mercenary companies to wage war, a model that would dominate later medieval conflicts. In England, Edward III saw his influence abroad expand, but his domestic base weakened. With landowners dead, laborers scarce, and Parliament dominated by a rising gentry class, the monarchy's reliance shifted toward the emerging commons, a political shift that would lead, over decades, to greater parliamentary authority. The rise of the urban republics. While feudal monarchies suffered, urban republics and city-states flourished, particularly in Italy and the Low Countries. In Florence, the plague killed an estimated 60% of the population, but those who remained, especially merchants and bankers, seized power vacuums left by dead noble families. Wealthy guilds like the Arte di Calamala, wool merchants, and Arte dei Medici e Speziali, doctors and apothecaries, gained increasing influence in government. By 1355, the Signoria, governing body of Florence, was dominated not by old aristocracy but by merchant oligarchs, many of whom rose from the lower ranks. Political participation expanded slightly, but power was tightly controlled through patronage and wealth. In Venice, the ruling Council of Ten enacted strict quarantine laws and public health orders that increased the government's prestige. Their perceived competence in crisis solidified Venice's status as a maritime republic, balancing trade, health policy, and statecraft. In the Low Countries, cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp saw similar shifts. Merchant leagues grew in strength, and urban militias replaced feudal levies. Burgomasters, not dukes, now made critical decisions. These republics became islands of order in a sea of rural collapse. The fall of minor kingdoms and principalities. In Eastern and Central Europe, the plague dismantled many smaller realms. The Kingdom of Naples, ruled by Queen Joanna I, descended into instability. With large swathes of the nobility dead, her rule was contested by rival claimants, leading to civil war and foreign intervention by the Hungarian crown. In the Balkans, the fragile despotate of Epirus and Duchy of Athens saw their populations so diminished that their armies and treasuries withered. Ottoman forces would later find little resistance as they expanded. In Bohemia, King Charles IV used the opportunity to consolidate lands and authority. He issued the Golden Bull of 1356, which strengthened the role of prince-electors in the Holy Roman Empire, turning a time of chaos into one of legal reform. Meanwhile, many minor baronies and ecclesiastical territories simply vanished. The bishopric of Skara in Sweden lost all but 2 of its clergy and functioned unofficially for decades. Noble families with no heirs saw their fiefs absorbed by larger powers, or left to squatters. The Papal States and Avignon. The papacy, based in Avignon, wielded extraordinary power during the plague, but its position became politically precarious. Pope Clement VI, who had granted blanket absolutions and survived by isolating between fires, died in 1352. His successors struggled to maintain order as the credibility of the Church waned. The Papal States in central Italy suffered from internal revolts. Towns like Bologna and Perugia rejected papal authority, asserting local rule through merchant councils or warlords. In Rome, the plague's devastation weakened local noble families like the Colonna and Orsini, allowing radicals like Cola di Rienzo to stage populist uprisings, briefly declaring a new Roman Republic. The papacy itself would not return to Rome until 1377, and even then, its grip remained uncertain, leading soon after to the Western Schism, where multiple popes claimed legitimacy, fracturing the Church's political influence. The Ottoman advantage. The Ottoman Turks, not yet a dominant empire but rising fast, benefited indirectly from the plague. In Anatolia, their tribal structure and dispersed population made them less vulnerable to mass death than urban Christian cities. Their rivals, Byzantine garrisons, Bulgarian lords, and Serbian princes, were weakened by mortality and internal strife. By 1354, the Ottomans crossed into Europe via the Gallipoli Peninsula, establishing a foothold in the Balkans. This marked the beginning of a century-long push westward, capitalizing on power vacuums left by plague and disarray. The plague did not conquer the Ottomans, it cleared their path. The Islamic West, Mamluks and Maghrib. In the Islamic world, political effects were equally severe. In Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, the Black Death arrived in 1349. The city lost more than a third of its inhabitants, including scholars, artisans, and administrators. The government responded with public fasts, prayer processions, and generous almsgiving, but political fragmentation followed. Mamluk power shifted between rival military factions. Taxation became chaotic. Rural regions like Upper Egypt fell into neglect. Bedouin tribes reclaimed influence in outer provinces. In the Maghrib, especially Fez, Tunis, and Marrakesh, population losses were followed by tribal revolts and dynastic upheavals. The Marinid dynasty, dominant in Morocco, struggled to maintain authority as tax revenues dried up and local governors defied orders. The plague indirectly weakened Islamic governance in North Africa, opening future paths for Iberian and Ottoman expansion. Consolidation and centralization. Despite initial chaos, many rulers used the aftermath to centralize authority. In Portugal, King Pedro I strengthened royal justice systems, curbed noble power, and restructured land ownership to benefit the crown. In Scandinavia, King Magnus Eriksson of Sweden and Norway implemented land reforms, focusing on direct taxation rather than feudal dues. In the Holy Roman Empire, electors expanded their autonomy, but also formed alliances to stabilize trade and regional laws. The need for order, law, and revenue gave rise to more centralized bureaucracies. Surviving states realized that governance could no longer rely solely on hereditary right and military power. It now required records, taxes, health ordinances, and legal clarity. From kingdoms to coalitions. The cultural trauma of the plague had political echoes. Across Europe, new regional coalitions began forming. In Germany, the Hanseatic League, a commercial confederation of towns like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Riga, grew more powerful, controlling trade routes and imposing rules across the Baltic. In Switzerland, cantons formed the early shape of a confederacy, asserting independence from Habsburg influence. In Flanders, communes negotiated directly with monarchs, bypassing noble intermediaries. The map of Europe was no longer just a checkerboard of lords and kings. It became a lattice of leagues, councils, and civic republics, bound more by trade and contract than by feudal bonds. Power was dispersing, and also concentrating. A medical world without answers. When the Black Death descended upon Europe, it entered a world where medicine was rooted in medieval tradition, dominated by ancient Greek theory, church doctrine, and astrology. Physicians trained at universities like Montpellier, Salerno, and Oxford relied heavily on texts by Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, interpreting illness through the lens of humoral theory. According to this framework, the body's health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to arise from imbalance, often triggered by environmental factors, bad air, miasma, or moral failings. But none of these explanations accounted for the speed, horror, or scale of the Black Death. As the dead piled up, the old medical doctrines began to splinter. The failing of the physicians. In every major European city, doctors were among the first to die or flee. Their treatments, bloodletting, herbal compresses, enemas, and purging, were powerless. In Paris, the Faculté de Médecine issued a famous report in 1348, commissioned by King Philip VI, blaming the plague on a celestial conjunction that corrupted the air. It recommended purification with rosewater, burning fragrant herbs, and abstaining from meat and bathhouses. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote, "The art of medicine, despite the number and experience of its practitioners, was of no avail. Doctors who remained wore plague robes, long waxed garments with leather gloves and beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs. The beak, resembling that of a carrion bird, was intended to protect them from the corrupt air. It became one of the most iconic and eerie symbols of plague medicine. Despite appearances, these physicians often did more observing than curing. Many began recording symptoms, death rates, and outcomes, creating some of the first detailed epidemiological notes in European history." Surgeons and practical medicine. As university physicians lost credibility, surgeons, once considered lesser tradesmen, gained influence. Barber surgeons, battlefield medics, and apothecaries provided hands-on care, lancing buboes, draining fluids, and applying poultices. While not always effective, these interventions offered visible action at a time of helplessness. In London, guilds of surgeons began documenting survival cases, noting that lancing buboes early appeared to save some lives. In Avignon, surgeons kept casebooks, annotated records of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes, used for training apprentices. These documents marked a shift from theoretical to empirical observation. Though rudimentary, they laid groundwork for what would become clinical medicine. Hospitals reimagined. Before the plague, medieval hospitals were religious institutions, focused more on spiritual care than physical treatment. They offered shelter, prayer, and basic sustenance to the poor and sick, operated by monks, nuns, and lay brothers. After the plague, with monasteries emptied and need overwhelming, the hospital's role began to evolve. In Florence, the Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova expanded rapidly, hiring secular staff and tracking patient entries, exits, and symptoms. In Paris, Hotel Dieu started accepting patients with contagious illnesses, separating them from the general population. In Barcelona, new hospitals were built outside city walls to isolate the sick, a precursor to quarantine hospitals. The concept of a hospital began to shift from spiritual hospice to institutional care center. Over time, secular authorities took control, funding hospitals through taxes, endowments, and civic donations. This movement set the stage for state involvement in public health. Early epidemiology and observation. With so many deaths and so few explanations, some began to study the plague itself, not as divine punishment, but as a phenomenon with patterns. In Siena, Matteo Villani, brother of the famous chronicler Giovanni, documented the outbreak stages: initial symptoms, progression, and time to death. He noted differences between towns, speculating on factors like climate and sanitation. In Lübeck, city officials recorded which neighborhoods were hardest hit, how fast the disease moved, and where it paused. Though lacking germ theory, these records were early attempts at disease mapping. A few daring voices even suggested person-to-person transmission. In Venice, where maritime controls were strict, some doctors began quarantining not just ships, but individuals exposed to the sick, a radical act based on observation, not belief. These were not yet scientists, but their notations and inferences were proto-scientific. Astrology, superstition, and the cosmic blame. Despite signs of change, astrology remained deeply entwined with medicine. Physicians often consulted star charts before diagnosing or bleeding patients. Calendars marked unlucky days for treatment. The Paris medical faculty continued to teach astrology alongside anatomy. Some practitioners blamed eclipses, comets, or sunspot activity. In England, Manuscripts like the Rosa Anglica advised treatment based on the zodiac sign governing the afflicted body part. At the same time, folk healers and mystics offered alternatives. In rural areas, herbalists, midwives, and cunning men sold poultices, talismans, and spells. Wolfsbane, sage, and rue were brewed into teas. Amber and jet stones were worn against the skin to repel infection. Charms with biblical inscriptions were hung around necks or tied to bedposts. Though often dismissed by authorities, these healers were trusted by locals, particularly in regions where doctors had vanished. This blending of folk medicine, superstition, and spiritual healing created a medical culture rooted in pragmatism. If it worked, it was kept, regardless of origin. The crumbling of Galen and ancient authority. The failure of classical texts to predict, explain, or cure the plague began to erode faith in inherited knowledge. Galen's humors had no answers for sudden death and grotesque symptoms. Hippocratic theories of environmental balance could not explain why one house was wiped out while the next was untouched. Avicenna's canon of medicine, long revered, was now openly questioned in some circles. In Montpellier, younger medical scholars began annotating their copies of ancient texts with skeptical notes. In Salerno, a teacher was reprimanded for suggesting that what is seen with the eyes may contradict what is read in books. This quiet rebellion didn't yet overturn the canon, but it planted seeds of doubt. Over the next century, this doubt would germinate into dissection, experimentation, and empiricism. Dissection and the human body. Before the plague, dissection of human corpses was rare, often restricted or conducted in secret. After the plague, with so many unclaimed bodies and a desire to understand death, dissection gained tentative acceptance. In Bologna, Mondino de Aliuzzi, who had dissected corpses before the plague, saw his works gain popularity, reprinted with vivid anatomical illustrations. In Padua, by the 1360s, anatomy theaters began taking shape, offering public dissections to students. Florence authorized a civic physician to dissect criminal corpses in the interest of public knowledge. These developments marked a shift toward the body as a subject of inquiry, not just spiritual vessel. Observing the body's decay and attempting to catalog its function was becoming acceptable, even useful. Seeds of scientific change. The plague did not birth modern science, but it loosened the bindings of old truths. Faced with death's indifference, scholars began to ask different questions. Why did some people survive and others perish? Why did the disease return in waves? Could cities be built to prevent contagion? Could treatments be tested, compared, improved? In universities, natural philosophy edged closer to what we would call empirical science. Though religious faith remained strong, a space opened for observation, measurement, and doubt. By 1375, the intellectual climate was unsteady but fertile. Across Europe, a generation was coming of age whose first memories were of plague, whose parents had died in heaps, whose world had been proven fragile. They were less inclined to accept the world as it had been. They were more inclined to explore the world as it could be understood. A new palette of darkness. The plague redefined not only how Europe lived and governed, it transformed how it dreamed, created, and remembered. In the century that followed, the cultural landscape bore deep scars of collective trauma. Pain seeped into paint, death danced through poetry, and memory became the very canvas of artistic creation. Where once medieval art had aspired to heavenly transcendence, now it descended into the grave, studied the corpse, and spoke of rot, ruin, and resurrection. This was not yet the Renaissance, but the first tremors of a cultural transformation were already stirring. Visual art, from glory to the grave. Before the Black Death, much of European art focused on biblical scenes rendered in bright tempera colors. Saints in gold halos, Mary enthroned, Christ triumphant. After the plague, a different aesthetic emerged. In Tuscany, frescoes like the Triumph of Death by Buonamico Buffalmacco adorned the walls of cemeteries, most notably in the Camposanto Monument Ale of Pisa. These massive murals showed corpses strewn on the ground, noblemen recoiling, and monks contemplating decay. In Siena, the painter Bartolo di Fredi incorporated grotesque imagery into religious panels. Christ surrounded by the sick, angels weeping beside open graves. In Germany, altarpieces depicted skeletons pulling kings from thrones, whispering to bishops, dragging maidens into shadowed tombs. This rise of macabre realism was not a rejection of faith, but a confrontation with its cost. Death was no longer abstract. Artists had seen it, touched it, buried it, and now rendered it in pigment. Graveyards became open-air galleries. Ossuaries, where bones were stacked in patterns and niches, became spaces of sacred artistry. The Vanitas motif also appeared, still life paintings showing wilted flowers, extinguished candles, hourglasses, and skulls, reminding viewers of mortality's inevitability. Literature of survival and reflection. Writers, too, felt compelled to reinterpret the world they had barely survived. Some turned to structured escape, others to harsh realism, and a few to introspective metaphysics. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in the direct wake of the 1348 Florentine plague, framed his Decameron as a collection of stories told by 10 young people fleeing to the countryside to escape death. The tales range from bawdy to tragic to philosophical. What was revolutionary was not just the subject matter, but the style. Written in the vernacular Italian, not Latin. Characters were secular, often middle class. Tone shifted between humor and horror, a mirror of real life. Boccaccio created a literary space for survivors, a space where one could laugh again without betrayal, mourn again without collapse. In France, Christine de Pizan, one of Europe's first professional female writers, composed moral and political treatises in the late 14th century that emphasized reason, virtue, and civic responsibility in a world destabilized by death. In England, William Langland's Piers Plowman emerged in the 1370s as an allegorical journey through a morally fragmented society. Its dream visions were filled with abandoned churches, corrupted priests, and starving laborers. Geoffrey Chaucer, born during the plague and writing decades later, infused his Canterbury Tales with layered human voices, pilgrims on the road, carrying tales of deception, piety, desire, and sorrow. The Black Death is never the center, but it is always the shadow behind the journey. Music, from choirs to chants. The plague left an imprint on medieval music as well. Choirs were devastated. Monasteries where Gregorian chant once echoed fell silent. Survivors sought new modes of expression. The Dies Irae, Day of Wrath chant, though older than the plague, became culturally central in the late 14th century, used in funeral masses and adapted for polyphonic settings. In Italy and France, the Ars Nova, New Art musical style evolved, allowing greater rhythmic complexity and emotional expression. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut in France and Francesco Landini in Italy created music of mourning and beauty. Landini, blind from childhood and a survivor of the plague, wrote melodies of aching elegance. His ballata Ecco la Primavera, Here is Spring, has been interpreted as a longing for renewal, composed in the quiet after devastation. Musical notation systems also advanced, spurred by the need to preserve music after so many composers and performers had died. Theater and allegory. Theater, already part of European tradition in the form of mystery and morality plays, became increasingly allegorical after the plague. In traveling performances across France, Germany, and England, death was personified, not as evil, but as inevitable, impartial, and sometimes weary. In morality plays, characters like Everyman, Pride, Greed, and Death confronted each other on simple wooden stages. Everyman, written toward the end of the century, shows a man summoned by death, forced to reckon with his deeds. His friends and possessions abandon him, only good deeds remains. The Castle of Perseverance, performed in 15th century East Anglia, dramatized the human soul's struggle amid temptation, salvation, and mortality, its form, content, and staging shaped by a culture that had faced oblivion. Theatrical culture after the plague embraced moral reflection, symbolic imagery, and communal participation, often performed outdoors near churches or cemeteries. Language and the rise of the vernacular. The linguistic landscape also began to shift. For centuries, Latin had been the language of theology, science, and literature. But the emotional weight of the plague spurred authors to write in the language of the people. Italian, French, English, German. This wasn't simply a stylistic choice. It was an act of accessibility, of witness. Survivors wrote not for posterity, but for each other. This gave birth to the lay reader, the merchant poet, the literate artisan. More people than ever before were encountering written words about the world they themselves knew, a step toward mass literacy and the civic humanism of the coming Renaissance. The trauma of the plague cracked open the walls of the monastery and university. Words escaped. Visual symbols and death iconography. As plague returned in recurrent waves, artists and artisans began to codify new symbols of death. Hourglasses, a visual representation of life's brevity. Skeletons, not just morbid images, but communicators, messengers of truth. The scythe, borrowed from agricultural tools, became death's primary icon. Open graves, often shown in manuscript margins, particularly in books of hours. In the Nuremberg Chronicle, an illustrated world history published in 1493, the plague is rendered with engravings of skeletal armies and sprawling cemeteries. Death had become personified, democratized, and localized. Books of hours and private piety. One of the most intimate cultural shifts was the rise of personal devotional books. Small, portable manuscripts called books of hours, tailored for private prayer. After the plague, these books often included plague-specific prayers, pleas to saints like Sebastian and Roch, and imagery of death. Marginalia, notes and drawings in the margins, sometimes showed dancing skeletons, decaying corpses, or crying angels. These books reflected a shift toward individualized spirituality. People no longer trusted only the church to mediate salvation. They began praying on their own, reading at home, building shrines. It was quiet, personal, and deeply shaped by a world where the last words one said might be their last words ever. Rebuilding through creativity. Cultural life did not simply mourn. It reassembled itself, slowly and strangely. Tapestry production resumed, now with darker tones and new allegories. Illuminated manuscripts included humor alongside horror, foxes at funerals, angels vomiting light. Craft guilds sponsored altarpieces as acts of penance and thanksgiving for surviving. Architectural renovations in cities like Milan, Brussels, and Prague included dedications to plague saints, their stone faces watching from rooftops and spires. Aesthetic innovation came not in spite of suffering, but because of it. The world had changed. Its stories, its images, its language, all had to change as well. The plague that never left. Though the Great Mortality of 1347 to 1352 is remembered as the most devastating phase of the Black Death, the plague did not disappear after its initial eruption. It returned again and again, striking different regions of Europe in decadal waves, sometimes local, sometimes widespread, always feared. It became, not an event, but a condition of existence. The medieval and early modern world learned to live with the expectation that plague would return, as surely as famine, as surely as war. Second outbreaks and the 1374 epidemic. The first major resurgence occurred in 1374, just over 2 decades after the first wave. It swept through Italy, with particularly brutal outbreaks in Florence, Milan, Venice, and Pavia. In Milan, Giovanni Visconti, the archbishop and de facto ruler, sealed entire city blocks when a single case was discovered, ordering doors and windows bricked up, a practice that had begun in earlier outbreaks but now became standard urban policy. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Priests refused to enter homes. In Venice, gondolas bearing the dead drifted under empty bridges, city officials shouting orders from boats rather than setting foot on land. The 1374 outbreak spread north into the Rhineland, and by autumn reached Basel, Strasbourg, and Cologne, where it killed thousands in weeks. Chronicles describe the plague moving with alarming precision, sparing one town and decimating the next, as if guided by invisible logic. The 1390s and the institutionalization of response. By the 1390s, most cities had begun to establish permanent health magistracies. These were no longer ad hoc crisis groups, they were formal organs of governance. In Florence, the Officio della Sanità became a standing committee with power to inspect goods at ports, issue licenses for gravediggers, dispatch plague doctors to infected homes, administer plague hospitals and isolation houses. In Marseille, similar health offices recorded case numbers, monitored deaths, and tracked the movement of goods and people. The plague was no longer merely a spiritual crisis, it was now a matter of administration. 1400 to 1450. Plague in a new century. The 15th century brought more localized, though frequent, flare-ups. Some areas endured long reprieves, while others suffered every decade. In England, major outbreaks occurred in 1407, 1426, 1433, and 1456. Parish records in Norwich and Canterbury show burial rates tripling during these years. Rural areas, once considered safer, were no longer spared. One Norfolk Chronicle describes, "The plague moves as wind, silent, sudden, and without cause. One cottage will fall, another stands." In France, plague returned to Paris in 1418, during the chaos of the Armagnac-Burgundian civil conflict. Famine and siege accelerated the spread. Refugees fleeing war often carried fleas and rats with them into the cities they hoped would protect them. In Central Europe, Bohemia and Poland suffered repeated outbreaks. The city of Krakow recorded a severe wave in 1448, during which the newly constructed university closed its doors and suspended teaching for over a year. The 1460s, urban memory and ritualization. By mid-century, the plague had become ritualized in civic life. In Nuremberg, Cologne, and Dijon, cities began observing plague remembrance days, marking anniversaries of previous outbreaks with public prayers, processions, and fasts. Churches dedicated to Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch multiplied. These saints, believed to have interceded during previous plagues, became central figures in civic iconography. Sebastian, martyred by arrows, was depicted with his wounds as metaphors for buboes. Roch, a 14th-century pilgrim who survived plague and healed others, was shown lifting his tunic to reveal a plague sore. In Bruges, families gathered annually at the Chapel of the Holy Blood to give thanks for surviving the 1439 plague. In Lisbon, coastal watchtowers flew black flags when plague was spotted in incoming ships. These acts were not only spiritual, they were civic anchors in a world where the ground could open at any time. Public health becomes civic identity. By the late 1400s, cities began competing for the most advanced public health policies. The threat of plague turned cleanliness, surveillance, and quarantine into status symbols. In Venice, the island of Lazaretto Vecchio was expanded, becoming the world's first permanent quarantine hospital. Infected individuals were housed in stone buildings, with designated burial zones, physicians, cooks, and guards. Staff were rotated and isolated. In Dubrovnik, a 30-day Trentina quarantine was extended to 40 days Quarantina, with specific areas designated for travelers, animals, and goods. City statutes outlined punishments for breaking quarantine, including fines, imprisonment, and public shaming. In Milan, city officials established a plague map, marking the locations of known infections with chalk. This early data visualization informed public behavior and city-wide restrictions. These measures were no longer temporary. The plague had forced cities to build entire bureaucracies of survival. Shifts in medical theory. As recurrence became normal, medical theory tentatively adapted. By 1460, physicians began moving away from strict humoral theory and incorporating environmental contagion models. Though germ theory would not emerge until centuries later, many doctors accepted that plague was transmissible through contact, proximity, or air. In Paris, medical treatises suggested removing rugs, burning straw beds, and bathing in rose vinegar. In Florence, public notices warned against handling the clothes of the dead, a major step toward understanding fomite transmission. Some surgeons and apothecaries began keeping plague manuals, describing symptoms, survival rates, and successful interventions. These texts circulated between cities, copied by hand, forming a growing body of practical medical literature. Treatments remained mostly ineffective, but the act of systematic recording marked a cultural turning point. The disease could be studied, categorized, anticipated. Memory carved in stone. In towns and villages, plague memorials became common features of the landscape. In Vienna, the Pestsaal, plague column, was erected after the 1679 outbreak, but its prototype began in the 15th century, when smaller columns were raised in squares and crossroads. In Salzburg, survivors built a chapel on a hill where they had taken refuge. In Barcelona, an entire neighborhood was named after the Hospital de la Santa Creu, which had expanded dramatically during the plague years. These sites blended memory, gratitude, and fear. They were visited on anniversaries, used in processions, and woven into local identity. In many places, mass graves were marked with symbols: skulls, hourglasses, or simple stone slabs etched with the year. Over time, these graveyards became parks, churches, or marketplaces, daily life continuing atop the layers of the lost. Artistic response to recurrence. Art and literature also evolved to meet the ongoing presence of plague. In Northern Europe, artists like Hans Memling and Rogier van der Weyden painted detailed crucifixions and martyrdoms, often including plague saints and references to recent outbreaks. The Dance of Death motif continued to appear in manuscripts and church walls, now with more elaborate detail. Death not just as a moment, but as a companion. Books of Hours from the late 15th century included updated plague prayers, new marginal drawings of pestilence, and instructions for confession during quarantine. Writers like Heinrich Wittenweiler and John Lydgate composed allegories where cities are judged by God for failing to uphold justice, love, or humility. Plague portrayed as a mirror, not just punishment. This reflection was not defeatist. It was an effort to explain endurance. Children of the Plague. By 1500, an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing else. They had never known a world without pestilence. They had learned to read by candlelight in shuttered rooms, to pray at windows, to avoid touch, to bury quietly, to trust no spring that came too early. And yet, they rebuilt. The late 15th century saw cities recover their populations, rebuild economies, and expand institutions. Universities reopened. Trade resumed. Art flourished. But always, in the background, plague remained possible. It had moved from catastrophe to condition, the dark hum beneath the surface of European life. A world newly aware of distance. As Europe moved into the second half of the 15th century, it did so with a sharpened sense of geography, distance, and risk, all shaped by a century of recurrent plague. Cities had learned to chart movement, monitor goods, and isolate strangers. This habit of surveillance would be exported into the early global age, as exploration, trade, and conquest expanded European borders. The Black Death did not only leave a legacy in Europe's streets and memory, it left one in how Europeans viewed the rest of the world. Contact now meant not only opportunity, but danger. The Portuguese and the Precautionary Empire. By the 1470s, the Portuguese were sailing south along the West African coast, establishing forts and trading posts in Argan, Elmina, and eventually Benin. Gold, ivory, and slaves were sought, but so was safety. Portuguese ships carried physicians and plague protocols. Captains were instructed to observe the health of coastal populations before disembarking. Sailors returning from African voyages were subject to quarantine at Lisbon and Porto. The plague, believed to come from corrupt air and foreign miasmas, justified extreme caution. The establishment of quarantine islands, small offshore rocks where infected crews were left to die or recover, became common practice. This was not scientific epidemiology. It was a cultural reflex, deeply rooted in the trauma of 1348. Venice, the Levant, and the logic of walls. Venice, master of Mediterranean commerce, had suffered greatly in the 14th century. By the 15th, it had developed the most advanced plague prevention system in the world, and it applied this knowledge abroad. Merchants arriving from Constantinople, Alexandria, or Beirut were scrutinized, their cargo burned or fumigated, their persons washed in vinegar and salt water. Entire shiploads were detained on Lazaretto Vecchio, and later Lazaretto Nuovo, for 40 days, hence, quarantena. When Venice expanded its influence into Crete, Cyprus, and the Dalmatian coast, it exported not only its commerce, but its medical enforcement culture. The Venetian plague ordinances would become templates for other empires, influencing not only health policy but the administrative architecture of colonialism. Spanish colonization and the fear of the body. The Spanish crown, emerging from the Reconquista, soon turned its attention to the Atlantic and beyond. With the voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492, contact between Europe and the Americas was established. While the most devastating disease in that encounter was smallpox, which Europeans brought to the New World, Spanish explorers feared they might contract strange plagues from the indigenous peoples they met. Letters from Hernán Cortés in Mexico mentioned concern over foreign mists and vapors, and some of his men carried vinegar flasks and aromatic sachets, just as plague doctors had in Europe. When plague struck Seville in 1507, Spanish port authorities began implementing sanitary inspection for ships arriving from the Americas. The Old World now saw the new not only as exotic, but epidemiologically suspect. The conquest of Tenochtitlan, the fall of the Inca Empire, and the devastation of native populations by European diseases were justified in part by the rhetoric of purification. of cleansing the land of both spiritual and physical corruption. This logic, shaped in the aftermath of plague, informed European approaches to colonization. The other was not only alien, but possibly infectious. The Ottoman Empire and trans-regional surveillance. In the Ottoman Empire, which now controlled vast territory across the eastern Mediterranean, Balkans, and parts of Arabia, the plague was no less feared. Major outbreaks struck Constantinople in 1467, 1492, and again in 1501. Sultans maintained plague registers, Ta'an Defteri, which documented the spread of infection across towns and provinces. Caravan routes were monitored. Pilgrims to Mecca were tracked, and those who returned from outbreaks were isolated. The Ottomans also established public bath regulations, waste disposal ordinances, and burial protocols for plague victims. While rooted in Islamic jurisprudence, their practices were parallel to European health boards, shaped by similar repeated trauma. When Ottoman armies marched into Europe, their health measures traveled with them, creating overlapping zones of surveillance in the Balkans and Hungary. Trade and the codification of sanitary passports. By the late 15th century, plague was written into the paperwork of commerce. Cities began issuing fedi di sanità, health bills, or sanitary passes, certificates declaring that a person, ship, or caravan came from a plague-free zone. Without this document, entry to ports or cities was denied. In Ragusa, merchants arriving from the east needed a signed pass from their previous stop. In Marseille, city clerks maintained registers of every arriving traveler, marking those from infected areas in red ink. In Genoa, forged health passes became punishable by death. This was the beginning of international health documentation, an early precursor to passports and border controls based on disease status. Plague had forced the world to begin codifying mobility. The plague as a lens of superiority. In addition to policy, the cultural memory of the plague shaped how Europeans viewed non-European societies. Civilizations that lacked formal quarantine or disinfection methods were seen as backward or dangerous. Letters from Italian travelers to Egypt in the 1490s speak of the reckless openness of Cairo, where infected and well mingled freely in markets. In contrast, Venetian, Genoese, and Spanish ports were increasingly designed with segregated districts. The sick, the foreign, the native, and the elite separated by walls, canals, or cordons. This architecture of containment mirrored a growing belief that Europe's suffering had taught it discipline, and that such discipline implied moral and civilizational superiority. The Black Death had not only reshaped Europe's health policy, it had quietly become a tool for self-definition. Theological export of plague frameworks. Missionaries accompanying explorers and traders brought with them not just Christianity but plague theology. They preached of divine judgment, moral purity, and the need to cleanse sin to avoid pestilence. This language was fused with a justification for conversion and conquest, especially in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Plague saints like Saint Sebastian were invoked in sermons in New Spain. Altars dedicated to Our Lady of Health were erected in Goa. European religious frameworks that had formed under the pressure of the plague were now transplanted into colonial contexts. Fear of disease became interwoven with missionary urgency. Salvation was not only of the soul, it was imagined as protection from the bodily corruption that had once stalked Europe. Early globalization and vector awareness. Though the microbe Yersinia pestis would not be discovered until 1894, the 15th century already saw a growing awareness of movement-based contagion. Silk, wool, and fur were suspected carriers. Waterfronts were treated with caution. Rats, though not fully understood, were increasingly noted in city records as needing control. Port cities employed rat catchers, fumigated storage warehouses, and constructed stone quarantine barracks for both humans and goods. In Lisbon, Valencia, and Marseille, plague hospitals were built with separate wards for incoming foreign patients. Trade routes between India, the Middle East, and Europe were now governed not only by profits and diplomacy, but by plague surveillance. Even as Europe reached out into the world, it did so through a veil of fear, one learned through generations of exposure to death. The shadow in expansion. The same ships that carried Renaissance art, gold, and gunpowder also carried the silent lessons of the Black Death. With every contact, Europeans weighed profit against pestilence. Globalization, in its earliest form, was inseparable from the memory of contagion. The reflex to inspect, isolate, record, and regulate movement. first born in panic on the docks of Genoa and Marseille, became a permanent feature of empire. Europe would now shape the world not only through force, but through its remembered fear. The reawakening of the self. The repeated return of the plague, wave after wave, forced a transformation not only in politics, economics, and art, but in the European mind itself. As individuals buried parents, children, neighbors, and entire communities, the old structures that had once explained the universe, church, monarchy, tradition, and communal identity, began to feel insufficient. Survivors began asking, why me? Why now? What is this life? In that existential vacuum, the self became central. From the late 15th into the 16th century, European thinkers and writers began to interrogate the human condition in ways that had not existed before the Black Death. The plague had shown, repeatedly, that structures failed, that bodies decayed, and that truth could not always be inherited. It had to be found, felt, or reasoned. This moment did not reject faith, but it reframed it around individual experience. Montaigne and the personal essay. Perhaps the clearest expression of this introspective shift came in Michel de Montaigne, a French magistrate, philosopher, and survivor of plague outbreaks in Bordeaux. In 1580, Montaigne published the first volume of his essays unlike anything that had preceded them. They were not sermons, treatises, or commentaries. They were meditations on the self. I want to see myself as I am, Montaigne wrote, not as I ought to be. He wrote of his bodily sensations, his fears, his digestion, his dreams, his aging. Death was a constant companion in his pages, not a theological concept, but a physical and emotional reality. His essays reflect a mind shaped by plague. To philosophize is to learn how to die. Death is a part of you. You carry it with you. Montaigne's skepticism, his refusal to declare certainty, his embrace of doubt and curiosity, all were reflections of a world where plague had stripped away false permanence. He was not a radical. He was something rarer, a man thinking aloud amid silence. Humanism in a wounded world. While Renaissance humanism had roots predating the Black Death, its tone shifted in the aftermath. In early humanist works, like those of Petrarch, we see a mourning for a lost golden age. But in the late 15th century, figures such as Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Erasmus of Rotterdam began to explore human dignity and agency in a world marked by instability. Pico's oration on the dignity of man, 1486, declared that humans, unlike angels or beasts, had no fixed form. Man could ascend or descend. This malleability, this freedom, was a new assertion, born from a generation that had seen how easily rank, wealth, or piety could vanish under disease. Erasmus, in his praise of folly, satirized clerical corruption and blind tradition, while also emphasizing ethical behavior, education, and the inner conscience. Their writings reflect a Europe haunted by loss, but animated by possibility. The idea that through reason, virtue, and study, humans might not conquer death, but find meaning despite it. The body in philosophy and science. Plague's recurring assaults also forced a reappraisal of the body itself, not as a mysterious vessel of divine balance, but as a mechanism, vulnerable, observable, and flawed. This is visible in the anatomical texts of the period. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish physician, published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. The book was filled with precise, human dissections, illustrated in stunning detail. Vesalius explicitly challenged Galen, whose medical authority had ruled for over a millennium, and whose ideas had failed during plague. His work was based on direct observation, and it emphasized that the human body could be known by looking, not reading. This was a revolutionary step toward empiricism. It would not have been possible without the cultural rupture caused by plague, which had already shattered blind reverence for ancient authority. Reformers, prophets, and apocalyptic thought. Plague also reignited apocalyptic imagination, and this in turn fed into the religious upheavals of the 16th century. In Germany, Thomas Müntzer, a radical theologian, claimed the plague was divine punishment and called for the overthrow of all worldly authorities. In Florence, the fiery monk Girolamo Savonarola declared the pestilence was God's judgment on luxury and corruption. His sermons stoked fear and fervor until his own execution in 1498. Most significantly, in 1517, Martin Luther, a monk and theology professor, nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. While Luther's grievances focused on indulgences, the deeper roots of his reform were shaped by a world that had already seen the church fail during plague. Luther would later write during the 1527 outbreak of plague in Wittenberg, "One must not tempt God, but neither should one abandon his neighbor." His view combined duty, realism, and trust in personal conscience, core elements of the Protestant Reformation, which emphasized direct access to Scripture, individual faith, and the rejection of intercessory rituals that had often collapsed during plague years. Plague prepared the ground for reform. It made it plausible that centuries of tradition could be wrong, that something new could be necessary. Skepticism, observation, and the rise of inquiry. By the late 1500s, philosophers were openly discussing the limits of knowledge. Montaigne doubted certainty. Paracelsus, the Swiss physician, rejected traditional medicine and promoted chemical remedies, viewing the body as a site of alchemical transformation rather than balance of humors. Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600, speculated that the universe was infinite, that stars were suns, and that countless worlds existed. Ideas shaped in part by a realization that Earth was not protected, that death was not orderly. Francis Bacon, born in 1561, would later frame knowledge as something to be built not on tradition, but on experience, trial, and error. His emphasis on the scientific method came in a world already aware that ancient books had failed to halt the plague. These thinkers did not always speak of disease directly, but they thought in the wake of it. The changing concept of nature. Plague reshaped the relationship between man and nature. Once seen as a divinely ordered harmony, the natural world now appeared as unpredictable, even hostile. This shift is visible in painting and literature. Landscapes became more rugged, more detailed, less Edenic. Nature was rendered with a new realism, sometimes even threat. Animals in art took on symbolic meanings: rats, dogs, birds as harbingers, observers, companions to the dead. In poetry, the world was often described as transitory, a stage of suffering before heavenly reward, or, in some cases, as meaningless altogether. A sense of cosmic fragility permeated the culture. Individualism and the inner life. The final and most profound shift was in the emergence of the individual as a subject of inquiry and meaning. In art, portraits no longer only depicted saints or rulers. They captured merchants, widows, children, even anonymous donors, gazing back at the viewer with depth and specificity. In writing, autobiographical texts multiplied. People began to record their dreams, sins, reflections, and daily habits not as confession, but as preservation. Memory became a moral act. To write one's life was to resist its erasure. In death culture, epitaphs became more personal, less formulaic. Tombs bore inscriptions of character, legacy, even humor. The dead were mourned not just as souls, but as selves. Women and inheritance in the countryside. With so many men dead, women began inheriting property in numbers unseen before the plague. In Normandy, Lancashire, and Saxony, widows managed farms, leased land, and appeared in manorial court roles as independent agents. Some remarried quickly to consolidate holdings. Others remained single, forming matriarchal households with daughters, sisters, or neighbors. Legal systems adapted unevenly. In some regions, laws were passed to limit female landholding, fearing a collapse of patriarchal control. In others, customs shifted more freely, especially where survival depended on whoever remained. Female literacy in certain rural areas increased, as managing land required reading accounts, understanding contracts, and communicating with officials. The village woman was no longer just a peasant's wife. She could be a landowner, a manager, a survivor. Architecture and material culture. Plague left physical traces in rural architecture. In depopulated regions, many timber houses were left to rot. Those that remained were often reinforced with stone foundations when rebuilding occurred. Roof lines dropped, hearths grew larger, and glass windows, once a luxury, began appearing in wealthier peasant homes. Churches added plague chapels, small extensions dedicated to saints or containing votive paintings of survival. Field patterns changed as smaller plots were consolidated. Hedgerows were removed or re-established in new locations. Rural landscapes from Yorkshire to Flanders bear marks of this redrawing, visible even today in aerial photography and old boundary stones. New materials. Bricks, limewash, leaded glass appeared in the countryside, signifying both prosperity and change. A peasant who survived the plague and inherited land might live better than his grandfather ever dreamed. Oral traditions and memory. Plague also embedded itself into rural storytelling. While cities recorded their losses in chronicles, villagers remembered in tales, songs, and seasonal customs. In the Black Forest, a recurring figure was Der Graue Man, the Gray Man, who knocked on doors before sickness arrived. In Brittany, stories told of the Ankou, a skeletal figure with a cart who collected the souls of the dying. In Transylvania, it was said that plague traveled in the company of a weeping woman in black who entered homes through keyholes. These figures carried the memory of plague across generations, even when specific dates or events were forgotten. They shaped how children played, how grandmothers warned, and how communities understood the next illness. The countryside became a place where folklore and history fused, rooted in the soil where so many had fallen. Agricultural shifts and new techniques. With fewer people, those who remained had to innovate. Three-field rotation, already common, was more rigorously applied. Manuring became more widespread, improving yields. Horses replaced oxen in some regions for plowing, increasing speed. Tools improved. Scythes were better forged, plows better balanced. Some of these changes were not direct responses to plague, but they occurred in an environment opened up by necessity. Scarcity demanded efficiency, and in some places, it led to experimentation that would later feed into the agricultural revolutions of the early modern period. The sea as gateway and threat. The Black Death entered Europe by sea, and for centuries after its first landing, the ocean remained both lifeline and vector. From the bustling ports of the Mediterranean to the wind-battered harbors of the North Sea, plague followed the rhythms of maritime trade, sails swelling with commerce and shadowed by contagion. The plague was never a purely inland disaster. It was a seaborne phenomenon, deeply entangled with the rise of global shipping, naval empires, and mercantile expansion. Every ship on the horizon was an opportunity and a question. What did it carry, and whom might it kill? Port cities under siege. Europe's great port cities, Venice, Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, Lisbon, Southampton, Hamburg, endured plague in ways unique to their location. Each outbreak they faced arrived not just on roads, but with tides, gulls, and cargo holds. In Venice, entire fleets were delayed or destroyed by plague policy. By the late 14th century, ships arriving from the Levant were required to anchor at a distance and signal their health status. Flags of different colors were flown: white for clean, yellow for suspect, black for death. Venetian harbormasters enforced inspection rituals. Cargo was opened with long tongs, letters were baked over fire or smoked in vinegar, and passengers were examined through ship railings. Marseille, ravaged in 1347 and again in the 1360s, began constructing stone barracks at its harbor's edge, early prototypes of maritime quarantine stations. In the north, Lübeck and Danzig, Hanseatic cities trading fur and timber, developed their own cordon policies. Ships arriving from infected areas were barred entry, redirected to isolation coves, or denied altogether. By the 15th century, the pattern had become standardized. A ship's first contact was no longer with a dock, but with inspection. Lazarettos. Islands of waiting. The invention of the lazaretto, an isolated quarantine station, often on an island, was a turning point in plague control. Though Venice established the first formal lazaretto on Lazaretto Vecchio in 1423, the concept quickly spread. In Ragusa, Dubrovnik, a quarantine island was established as early as 1377, with its own guards, chaplains, and stone perimeter. In Marseille, by the 1520s, the Isle de Pommes became a fully operational quarantine zone. In Genoa, the Lazaretto di Pri stood as both a place of detention and treatment. Sailors and passengers suspected of exposure were sent to lazarettos for 40 days, a period derived from biblical symbolism, not medical science. 40 giorni equals 40 days. Inside these islands, meals were passed through sliding hatches. Chambers were whitewashed and fumigated. Priests administered last rites through barred windows. Cargo was aired or burned. For some, quarantine ended in recovery. For many, it ended in death. Those who died were buried on the island, often in lime-filled pits, never to return home. Lazarettos became liminal spaces, neither prison nor hospital. Cities of the almost dead, floating just beyond reach. Maritime quarantine protocols. By the mid-15th century, plague prevention was deeply codified in the maritime world. Ship captains were required to carry health patents, certificates issued by port authorities confirming that the ship's point of origin was plague-free. These patenti di sanità or bills of health became essential documents. Sailors disembarking without them could face imprisonment, fines, or public humiliation. In some cities, a ship's captain who concealed an outbreak faced execution. Customs evolved to reduce transmission. Letters were opened with heated tongs. Coins were soaked in vinegar before exchange. Fresh goods like fruit or bread were refused entirely. Passengers were forbidden from touching dockworkers. The profession of harbor surgeon emerged, tasked with inspecting ships for signs of plague. These men were often former military physicians or apothecaries, paid by city authorities to stand between commerce and catastrophe. Some harbors also maintained plague guards, armed units who patrolled shorelines and watchtowers, ready to fire upon vessels that attempted to dock illegally. The sea was no longer open, it had been medically regulated. Ships and disease vectors. The very design of ships made them perfect for harboring plague. Rats thrived in grain stores, coil ropes, and bilge holds. Fleas nestled in furs, textiles, and sailors' bedding. Poor sanitation aboard long voyages created breeding grounds for multiple pathogens. Merchant galleys, packed with goods and men, were especially dangerous. Conditions below deck, crowded, humid, and dark, encouraged the spread of disease. Even smaller coastal vessels could carry plague from port to port in days, outrunning land-based warnings. Ships were also mobile vectors for cultural knowledge about disease. Sailors shared stories of symptoms, cures, and rumors. Plague lore spread with them, talismans, folk remedies, maritime saints. In this way, the maritime world became not only a highway for infection, but a network of information, linking Alexandria to Bruges, Valencia to Bristol, with shared fear and borrowed practices. The plague ship in imagination. Plague ships entered cultural imagination as symbols of dread. Tales spread across Europe of ghost ships, vessels found adrift with sails flapping, crew dead at their posts, no sound but the creaking mast. These stories weren't pure legend, they echoed real incidents, such as a Venetian galley found off the coast of Dalmatia, its entire crew dead, anchor lowered but never tied. A Spanish carrack that drifted into Lisbon harbor in 1475, rats spilling from the hold. A Flemish merchant ship that unloaded cargo before symptoms appeared, unleashing a wave of infection into Antwerp. In literature and visual art, these ships became allegorical. Death sailing unseen, guided by the wind. Mariners spoke of seeing blue flames dancing on rigging, or of birds circling doomed ships. Some sailors refused to board vessels that had arrived too quickly, suspecting that unnatural speed meant ghostly assistance. Maritime guilds and health regulation. Maritime trade was overseen by powerful guilds and brotherhoods, such as the Arte del Mare in Italy and the Street Nicholas Guild in the Hanseatic cities. These guilds played a role in plague mitigation, enforcing hygiene standards for ships, providing burial funds for members lost to pestilence, negotiating health rules with city councils to ensure continued trade. Guilds also funded chapels, altars, and processions dedicated to seafarers' plague saints, especially Saint Nicholas, Saint Elmo, and Our Lady of the Safe Voyage. A generation of orphans. The plague reshaped not only the living world but the structure of those who survived. In its wake, inheritance law, family identity, and kinship networks evolved into new forms, often improvised, sometimes codified, always altered by the repeated experience of catastrophic loss. Entire generations of children were left parentless. In many cities, the number of orphans was so great that new institutions, hospices, orphanages, and foundling homes, were created to hold, feed, and sometimes educate those who had no household to claim them. In Florence, by 1370, nearly a third of all testaments contained provisions for the support of orphan kin or even unrelated children. The Ospedale degli Innocenti, founded in 1419, became one of the first formal orphanages in Europe, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. Its arches a civic declaration of Florence's duty to its abandoned young. These orphans, figli della peste, grew up in a world that recognized lineage not just by blood, but by necessity. Inheritance in crisis. With mass death came a legal conundrum. How to transfer property when entire families had vanished. Under medieval law, inheritance was typically patrilineal. Property passed from father to son, or closest male relative. But plague deaths rarely respected orderly succession. Wills, when they existed, were often written in haste, unsealed, and signed, or witnessed by people who died before the documents could be enforced. The consequences were far-reaching. In France, legal disputes over farmland inheritance quadrupled between 1350 and 1380. In Tuscany, courts saw a dramatic increase in contested wills, many of which involved minor children or distant cousins. In London, city officials began appointing public guardians to manage the estates of orphans, leading to the creation of wardship systems that would become standard in English law. Women, particularly widows and daughters, entered the inheritance system in greater numbers. While some regions resisted this shift, others adapted out of pragmatic necessity. In parts of the Low Countries, it became common for daughters to inherit family businesses, especially in textile towns where their labor kept the looms running. In Bologna, female property ownership rose steadily through the 15th century. Not all these changes were permanent, but they cracked open legal precedent, showing that necessity could override tradition and that death made new rules possible. The rise of testamentary culture. The fear of dying intestate, that is, without a will, became a defining anxiety of plague-era Europe. Wills, once the domain of the wealthy, became commonplace among artisans, merchants, and even peasants. A testament was no longer just a legal transfer. It was a spiritual and social document, a way to shape memory, protect dependents, and direct salvation. In cities like Barcelona, Rouen, and Ghent, notaries developed formulaic plague wills, quickly drafted, clearly structured, legally viable even under duress. These often included bequests to the church for the soul's salvation, funds for funeral rites and masses, named guardians for minor children, instructions for burial location, preferably near loved ones, though space often dictated otherwise, charitable gifts to hospitals, confraternities, or plague wards. The writing of a will became a form of ritual, a preemptive act of memory, shaped by mortality's unpredictability. Some included deeply personal passages, apologies, blessings, even confessions. Others contained symbolic items, a piece of cloth, a ring, a book, to carry meaning across generations. The plague thus democratized legacy, not only as a material transfer but as a deeply human impulse to be remembered. Disintegration of extended kin networks. Before the plague, kinship networks were wide and resilient, a lattice of cousins, uncles, aunts, godparents, and in-laws that shared labor, protection, and reputation. But as plague reduced populations by half in many areas, these extended networks frayed and collapsed. Family lines disappeared. Surnames vanished. Ties that once held villages and parishes together were broken. This rupture had both legal and emotional consequences. Lineage-based claims to land grew weaker. Cooperative farming and inheritance-sharing practices declined. Cultural memory was interrupted. Children raised by those who had never known their parents' histories. In some places, new forms of kinship emerged. In rural France, neighbors formed informal pacts to care for one another's children if plague struck. These god-sibling relationships became the basis for mutual inheritance and protection. In Bohemia and Silesia, guilds sometimes acted as surrogate families, offering burials, pensions, or apprenticeships to the children of deceased members. Fraternities and lay brotherhoods also expanded their roles, functioning as quasi-familial institutions, structured around charity and remembrance. The meaning of family became more elastic, shaped not just by blood but by shared survival. Marital patterns and reformation of households. Repeated waves of plague disrupted marriage markets across Europe. With large portions of the population lost, especially among men, widows often remarried quickly, and younger people faced shifting expectations around partnership. Average marriage age rose in many areas, particularly for women. Dowries decreased, or were waived entirely in exchange for inherited property or household stability. Second and third marriages became common, creating complex blended families. In some towns, civic authorities encouraged marriage to rebuild population numbers. In Milan, the city offered tax incentives to newlywed couples. In Vienna, Marriage bans were expedited during plague years, with priestly consent given in open squares rather than churches. Households adapted. A surviving uncle might raise his nephews alongside his own children. A widow might take in nieces or neighbors. The nuclear family became more fluid, more utilitarian, more reactive to absence. Legal records as testaments of absence. Plague years left behind not only death tolls but dense administrative records. Municipal registers, manorial rolls, parish books, and notarial archives are filled with lists of heirs, transfers of property due to death, claims of abandonment, petitions for guardianship, disputes over unpaid dowries. Each record is a testament not only to a death, but to a web of relationships suddenly strained or severed. In Strasbourg, a 1370 record reads, Johannes, son of Martha, is now declared ward of the city, his grandfather and 2 uncles having perished. The shoemakers' guild shall provide food until such time as he may serve. In Bruges, a 15th century petition from a young woman asks for her mother's wedding ring to be returned, despite having no legal claim, for remembrance, not wealth. These documents show a Europe learning to use law as memory, turning bureaucracy into a scaffold for the lives that had collapsed. Tombs, epitaphs, and the language of the lost. Family and identity were also recorded in stone. Tombs from the 15th and early 16th centuries grew more elaborate, not in gold or size, but in detail of inscription. Names of lost children, siblings, and spouses were carved into the margins. Lineages were reconstructed on tomb lids, often ending abruptly with, and the rest perished. In English country churches, brass plaques began listing entire households struck down in a single year. In Catalonia, mural funerary art depicted family members seated together at the heavenly banquet, sometimes with empty chairs for those too young to be remembered. Epitaphs became messages to the future, often speaking to the reader directly. You who pass, remember the fever that spared none. My sons are ash. Let the Lord remember their laughter. These markers were not just mourning, they were reclamation. The silence of the schools. As the Black Death carved through Europe, it did not spare its places of learning. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and early universities saw entire faculties vanish, libraries fall into disuse, and lecture halls stand deserted for years. By 1350, nearly all major centers of higher education, Oxford, Paris, Bologna, Montpellier, Prague, had lost professors, students, and administrators. Some universities suspended classes altogether. Others limped along with skeleton staff, unable to confer degrees or conduct examinations. In Paris, the once vibrant Sorbonne reported that by 1353, only 2 lecturers remained in the theological faculty. In Oxford, halls such as Balliol and Merton struggled to keep students enrolled. Some colleges were forced to sell land or valuables to maintain their endowments. Yet from this disruption came a transformation. The institutions that survived began to rethink who they served, how they taught, and what knowledge meant in a world full of graves. Shrinking faculties and shifting curricula. Before the plague, medieval universities were structured primarily around the liberal arts, with higher faculties of law, medicine, and theology. Instruction followed traditional authorities, Aristotle, Boethius, Galen, Augustine, interpreted through scholastic logic. But with so many masters gone and the social order in flux, curricula began to bend under pressure. In Bologna, the medical faculty revised its syllabus to include new case studies from plague observations. In Montpellier, anatomy received increased attention, especially the study of corpse decay and bubonic symptoms. In Prague, theological debate gave way to moral philosophy, reflecting a need to understand suffering, not just sin. Universities became less rigid, more experimental. Lectures began to incorporate personal observation, regional knowledge, and even eyewitness plague accounts. The distinction between scholar and survivor blurred. Some faculties of medicine began to translate Arabic and Hebrew texts previously ignored, looking for alternative explanations and treatments. Knowledge was no longer a fixed canon. It became a search, driven by necessity. Student populations reimagined. The demographic collapse led to a redefinition of the student body. Prior to the plague, students were overwhelmingly male, clerical, and elite, often preparing for ecclesiastical office. After 1350, With the clergy thinned and demand for civil administrators, medical practitioners, and scribes rising, universities began to open their doors wider. Sons of merchants, artisans, and even wealthy peasants entered university for the first time. In cities like Leuven, Heidelberg, and Salamanca, records show a marked increase in non-noble matriculants by the mid-15th century. Grammar schools, many attached to churches, began teaching reading and writing to children whose families had inherited wealth or risen socially after the plague. In England, the rise of chantry schools, founded to pray for the dead, unintentionally fostered literacy among the lower classes. These schools often accepted boys from a wide range of backgrounds in exchange for labor or small fees. The result was a slow but steady increase in lay literacy, especially in urban centers. The written word was no longer the domain of monks alone. Educational institutions rebuilt and expanded. By the mid-15th century, universities not only recovered, they multiplied. New foundations were laid. University of Vienna in 1365. University of Heidelberg in 1386. University of St. Andrews in 1413. University of Glasgow in 1451. University of Uppsala in 1477. These institutions were often founded with plague in mind, funded by survivors, dedicated to St. Sebastian or Rock, or designed with medical faculties front and center. Colleges became more autonomous, less dependent on church structures. Kings and municipalities increasingly funded and governed universities, bringing secular priorities, law, finance, governance, into academic life. In Italy, humanist schools emerged alongside traditional universities, emphasizing classical languages, ethics, and rhetoric. Thinkers like Vittorino da Feltri and Guarino da Verona taught that education should prepare citizens, not just clerics. The memory of death shaped these schools' ideals. Life was short, therefore, learning must be meaningful. Printing, reading, and the spread of plague texts. The invention of movable type by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s supercharged the transformation already underway. Books became cheaper, faster to produce, and easier to distribute. One of the earliest genres to flourish? Plague literature. Medical treatises on symptoms, treatments, and prevention were published in Latin and vernacular. Spiritual guides offering prayers, saint invocations, and plague mass rituals circulated widely. Plague chronicles, often first-hand accounts, were printed and read across regions, linking towns through shared trauma. The Pestbuch, or plague book, became a common fixture in households and libraries. It was both manual and memento, part science, part scripture, part survival guide. These books helped standardize knowledge, but they also created a new imagined community of survivors. People reading the same words, fearing the same disease, across vast distances. Humanist libraries and the reordering of knowledge. Post-plague humanists like Petrarch, Boccaccio, and later Erasmus began to collect, translate, and restore ancient texts, seeing in them a guide not just to lost wisdom, but to resilience and moral clarity. Libraries grew in both number and intention. The Laurentian Library in Florence, funded by the Medici family, focused on classical manuscripts. In Nuremberg, patrician families donated entire private collections to civic institutions. The Vatican Library, reorganized in the late 15th century, expanded its holdings to include Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic works. Where medieval libraries had often been closed, ecclesiastical, and restricted, the new model embraced openness, scholarship, and diversity of thought. The plague had made clear that knowledge had to be preserved in multiple places, accessible to multiple kinds of people. Education as moral fortification. In the centuries after the Black Death, the idea emerged that education itself could be a form of protection, not against plague in the physical sense, but against its moral and social disintegration. Civic leaders saw schools as ways to rebuild discipline, order, and virtue. Religious reformers used education to reaffirm moral standards, especially among the young. Secular authorities linked literacy with responsibility, encouraging widespread reading of moral exempla and plague legends. By 1500, in cities like Zurich, Antwerp, and Rouen, literacy campaigns were targeting apprentices, servants, and even domestic staff. The written word had become a form of civic inoculation. This expansion would lay the foundation for later mass education systems, and for the rise of printing-driven religious movements, such as the Reformation. teachers as survivors and guides. Finally, teachers themselves were transformed. No longer only cloistered scholars, they became navigators of grief, mediators of history, and curators of community memory. In plague-affected towns, schoolmasters were sometimes the only literate adults left. They read wills aloud. They copied names into parish books. They explained why the bells kept tolling. The unquiet psyche. In a Europe repeatedly marked by mass death, grief became more than a private emotion. It became a condition of culture. Cities, villages, households, and individuals carried the invisible weight of losses that never ceased. And while memorials were built, laws rewritten, and economies adapted, the internal, emotional aftermath of plague left no fixed monuments, only scattered reflections, hints of rupture, and new languages for pain. The mental world of post-plague Europe was shaped by cyclical trauma. Each return of the pestilence was not just a new crisis, it was the reopening of wounds that never fully healed. For survivors, especially children who witnessed plague early, life became a negotiation with memory, guilt, dread, and hope. Chronic fear and bodily vigilance. One of the most immediate and enduring psychological consequences of plague was hypersensitivity to the body. People learned to monitor themselves constantly. A cough could trigger panic. A sore under the arm might be studied obsessively. Sudden fatigue was interpreted as a warning from the grave. Accounts from the 15th century are filled with descriptions of self-diagnosis, often bordering on obsession. In Florence, a merchant's journal from 1464 includes entries like, "Woke with a hot breath. It is nothing, I think, but I have burned rosemary just in case." In Strasbourg, a notary recorded keeping vinegar by his bed to cleanse his breath each morning. He began sleeping with a clove of garlic in his mouth, so death does not enter while I dream. The body, once regarded as a vessel of divine order, was now a fragile fortress, its walls breached without notice. This awareness created a culture of anticipatory mourning, people fearing not just death, but the slow approach of death symptoms. The weight of survivors' guilt. For many who lived through multiple outbreaks, the deeper wound was not fear, but guilt. Guilt at surviving when others had not. Guilt at fleeing loved ones. Guilt at failing to bury family members or say proper prayers. A woman in Rouen, writing in the margins of a book of hours around 1470, scribbled the following lines. "I left my brother. I closed the door and he was coughing. He did not come out again. I took the key and burned it. I have the key still." This kind of testimony, raw, unadorned, hidden, echoes in fragments from across the continent. People blamed themselves for things they did not understand, but could not forget. Some expressed this guilt through acts of penance, leaving money anonymously at plague shrines, donating land to hospitals, walking barefoot on pilgrimages, commissioning prayers to be said for unnamed souls. In many cases, the most intense guilt came from surviving alone. Dreams and hallucinations. Plague altered the content of dreams. Chroniclers, physicians, and mystics recorded a growing number of accounts describing visits from the dead, premonitions, and night terrors. In Krakow, a Carmelite monk wrote in 1492 of nightly visions in which the dead lay across the chapel floor, whispering psalms without sound. In Bruges, a widow claimed to see her children standing outside the window each night, tapping to come in. Some dreams were hopeful, reunions, embraces, glimpses of peace, but most were filled with dread. Doorways that would not close, rivers of ash, processions of nameless bodies. Physicians noted a sharp rise in melancholia, a diagnosis that at the time encompassed sadness, anxiety, withdrawal, and fatigue. Treatments included music, herbal baths, and, occasionally, exorcisms. In cases of what we might now call post-traumatic stress, sufferers described hearing phantom coughing, smelling rot in clean spaces, seeing familiar faces on strangers, feeling watched by the unseen. The plague had embedded itself in the senses. The mind could not forget what the body had witnessed. Children of absence. Children raised in the post-plague world often grew up surrounded not by stability but by vacancy. Many lived with grandparents, distant relatives, or guardians. Some never learned the names of their parents. Others had no siblings, no cousins, Entire kinship webs had been erased. This created a generation shaped by early maturity, as they took on responsibilities quickly, anxiety around separation, fearing those they loved might vanish, silent mourning, unable to voice loss that no one around them remembered. Folk tales from this period began to reflect new themes. Orphan protagonists, characters searching for missing mothers, ghostly parents offering guidance or warning. In German nursery rhymes, death was personified not as a punisher, but as a lonely figure, misunderstood and unloved. Even children's play changed. In England, a rhyme likely derived from plague memory became popular. Ring a ring o' roses, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Though its origins are debated, its circular structure and fall mirror the choreography of plague dances and the rhythms of collapse. Children absorbed what their elders could not say. Rituals for the lost. In the absence of traditional mourning, new rituals emerged. Quiet, improvised, deeply personal. Lighting candles at home on the anniversaries of outbreaks. Marking door frames with chalk crosses. Wearing pieces of cloth from the garments of the dead. Keeping bones, teeth, or locks of hair in locked boxes. In Naples, a mother was found to have buried her child's shoes in the threshold of her rebuilt home. In Vienna, a man planted rosemary along the grave of a brother, replanting it every spring, alone. Not all rituals were material. Some people refused to speak the names of the dead, believing it would summon them back. Others recited prayers every night before bed, naming each person lost in a whisper. Entire communities held silent masses, where bells were not rung and no sermon was given, only presence, breath, and memory. Grief found its way where it could. Death's familiarity. After centuries of recurrence, death became not an interruption but a companion. It was painted into frescoes, carved into doorways, sung about in laments. It was part of seasonal cycles. Harvest, frost, thaw, plague. People spoke of death as a presence in the room, one that might be placated, delayed, or accepted. In northern France, it was common to leave an extra seat at table during outbreaks, for death, so he wouldn't take anyone else. The practice of keeping one's burial shroud folded beneath the bed became widespread. Some households designated a plague bag, a small sack of personal items to be buried with, in case no family remained to dress the body. This was not morbid, it was practical, intimate, and deeply psychological. To prepare for death was to claim some control over it. Love in the shadow. Amid all this, people continued to marry, to birth, to write poems, to dance. Love stories from the late 14th and 15th centuries often contained themes of urgency, fragility, and defiance. Two lovers promising to meet at a tree if they survived the year. Secret marriages during quarantine. Letters exchanged with hopes scribbled between prayers. In a world where tomorrow was never promised, love became a resistance to absence. A wound that shaped the world. By the beginning of the 17th century, the great waves of plague had ebbed and flowed across Europe for over 250 years. Some cities were struck a dozen times, others spared only to suffer later. Generations had been born, lived, and died under its shadow. The Black Death had long ceased to be a single event. It had become a historical atmosphere, and its afterimage lingered in policy, memory, identity, and the very stones of Europe's buildings. Yet from this long darkness, the contours of a new world emerged. Modern Europe, its systems, its imagination, its anxieties and strengths, was not built in spite of the Black Death, but through it. Cities rebuilt with memory in brick. By the early 1600s, the architecture of Europe bore plague's fingerprint. City planning now included broad avenues designed to improve air circulation. Windows were widened. Ventilation became a design priority. Cemeteries were relocated beyond city walls, no longer tucked between homes and churches. Hospitals were purpose-built, often with quarantine wards, gardens, and long corridors separating patients. In Milan, the Ospedale Maggiore, designed in the mid-15th century, became a model of functional beauty, an institution meant for healing, not just waiting for death. Public fountains were improved for sanitation. Latrines were regulated. Entire neighborhoods were redrawn after each outbreak to prevent bad air from settling again. The built world was now a world prepared. Systems of response become institutions. What had begun as ad hoc decrees during crisis became permanent bureaucracies. By the 17th century, many cities operated health magistracies with legal authority, standing quarantine boards, disease surveillance networks through parish and trade systems, plague hospitals, often staffed year-round in expectation of recurrence. In Venice, the magistrates of health became one of the most respected civic bodies. In London, the role of parish searchers, women who identified and reported plague deaths, continued well into the 1600s. These systems prefigured modern public health. The methods were still imperfect, but the concept had changed. The state was responsible for protecting bodies, not just punishing souls. The body was no longer just a religious vessel. It was a subject of governance. Print culture and crisis literacy. The invention of the printing press and the spread of printed media allowed the memory of plague to become portable, reproducible, and adaptable. Plague pamphlets were sold in stalls across Europe, including maps, prayers, symptom lists, and news from afflicted regions. Broadside ballads told stories of heroism, despair, and miraculous survivals. Plague ordinances, once posted on doors, were now printed and circulated across provinces. Diary entries and eyewitness testimonies began to circulate in printed form, preserving personal experiences for wider audiences. This democratization of grief, fear, and information created a shared memory, not confined to those who had lived through a given outbreak. By the early 1600s, school children in Germany and France read plague survival stories. Households kept printed guides on how to respond to future epidemics. Memory had become a kind of armor. Cultural transformation. From judgment to biology. Over the centuries, the spiritual understanding of plague, as divine punishment, gave way to a more naturalistic view. Even before the germ theory of disease, thinkers began to understand illness as something material, observable, and possibly preventable. Girolamo Fracastoro, in 1546, proposed that diseases might spread through seeds or spores. Paracelsus, earlier in the century, rejected humoral theory and saw disease as the result of external agents, not internal imbalances. Sanitary reformers argued that clean streets, separated waste, and fresh air were essential defenses, not just rituals. The result was a quiet shift in worldview. Misfortune did not always signal sin. Death was not always judgment. Sometimes it was the outcome of cause and effect, a sequence that could be understood, even interrupted. This way of thinking laid the groundwork for modern science, epidemiology, and rational medicine. Rituals that endured. Even as science advanced, rituals of mourning, remembrance, and protection remained. Many of them outlived the plague itself. The use of plague saints continued, particularly in rural and Catholic regions. Processions, votive offerings, and pilgrimages still marked anniversaries of outbreaks. Books of hours, woodcuts, and tomb inscriptions preserved the faces of the lost. In southern Italy, families continued to hang sacred herbs over doorways. In Bavaria, altars to Saint Sebastian remained decorated every spring. In Poland, churchyards held annual festivals where children sang songs of those taken by the fever. Europe, in its rituals, proved that remembrance is not about reliving, but about holding space for what shaped you. Psychological foundations of the modern self. The repeated confrontation with death, randomness, and grief shaped how Europeans understood themselves. The idea of the self as narrator, a person who could write a will, compose a diary, or leave an inscription, grew more common. Introspection, once a monastic exercise, became part of lay life. Personal identity became less tied to family name or status and more to memory, survival, and record. We see this shift in the literature of the 16th century. In Montaigne's essays, where he dissects the self in layers. In Shakespeare's plays, where madness, death, and memory swirl together. In Reformation pamphlets, where every man is urged to read, reflect, and repent individually. The Black Death had shattered the communal mirror, and in the shards, people began to find the shape of the individual. Plague as metaphor. By the time of the final major European outbreaks in the 17th century, such as the Great Plague of London, 1665, or Marseille, 1720, plague had become more than a disease. It was a metaphor. for corruption in governments, for heresy or social disorder, for hidden danger, invisible decay, for the limits of human control. Even as new diseases rose, smallpox, cholera, syphilis, plague remained the template of catastrophe. Painters still used the dance of death. Writers invoked pestilence to describe moral collapse. The memory of plague persisted not in symptoms, but in language, policy, and fear. The long tale of memory. Though the last great European outbreaks faded by the 18th century, the imprint of the Black Death reached far beyond. Medical practices, like quarantine, contact tracing, and disinfection, became part of public health foundations. Legal reforms, especially around inheritance and guardianship, were written into law codes. Architectural forms, hospitals, cemeteries, isolation structures, remained in place for centuries. Cultural imagination, from Gothic literature to early science fiction, bore plague's fingerprints. And in moments of new crisis, wars, famines, pandemics, Europe returned to its plague archive, to the old prayers, the old orders, the old drawings of saints and skeletons. The end. Because even when the plague passed, the story remained.